Chapter 8. After making certain the worst was behind them, Kiera and Jessie fell into a deep and dreamless sleep, curling together as the sun travelled the length of the sky and surrendered to the moon, which rose into the heavens, lighting the forest around them in a celestial glow. She was the first to awaken, blinking slowly into consciousness, staring vacantly at the sunlit trees. Then became abruptly aware that someone was lying on her hair. Ow! Her eyes flashed up with a protest, but the moment her gaze fell upon his face, she decided without hesitation that she wouldn't wake him. Even if she could manage it, under no set of circumstances could she bring herself to trouble the serene expression on his face. He looked like a portrait, completely different from the man she knew before. All the tight smiles and quick deflections that had come to define him had smoothed over into something untarnished and pure, something free of defenses and just beautiful. There really was no other word for it. She stared without moving, every inch of her body still pressed against his skin. The lines of his body had been sculpted to perfection, muscled yet lean. The body of a man just coming into his prime. But for all the strength, there was an undeniable loveliness to him as well. And, in the contrasts in colouring, the angles of his face, the long lashes that dusted the tops of his cheeks. For as much as she'd curled into him, he'd wrapped around her as well. Their legs were tangled, and their hands were lost. Sometime in the night, his head had come to rest on her shoulder, the tip of his nose grazing the hollow behind her ear. He slept so deeply that she might actually have worried if she hadn't been able to feel each shallow breath on the side of her neck, each pulse of his heart as strong as if it were her own. She closed her eyes, taking a moment to savour the sensation. Her parents had died before she could remember their comfort. Since then, she'd learned to get on by her own. In her entire life, she didn't know if anyone had ever held her so close. There was a hitch in his breathing. His arms tightened around her, then relaxed. "Good morning." He glanced down at her immediately, freezing in surprise when he realized they'd twisted so close. His face stilled with a flash of uncertainty before his lips curved into a tentative smile. "Good morning," he repeated, making no effort to release her. "How did you sleep?" She stared up at him, smiling shyly in return. "I had the strangest dream. You wanted to cross a bridge that I knew to be dangerous. I tried to stop you, but you fell in the river. I had to jump in after you. Saved both our lives." He nodded slowly, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. "I had the same dream, with a few minor changes." They laughed softly, their bodies notching together, still wrapped in each other's arms. With a secret flush, he started to lean back, but he caught her just as quickly, looking abruptly shy. "It's still cold," he murmured, avoiding her gaze. "Could we just talk for a while?" She froze uncertainly, lips parted in surprise. "Of course. I actually wanted to—" "I'm sorry for not telling you sooner," he interrupted softly. "About what I am. It wasn't out of a sense of shame. I have nothing but pride in being a shifter. It's just, you caught me at a bit of a crossroads. There are certain things in my past I was hoping to leave behind." She nodded slowly, feeling the pounding of his heart. "That's why you avoided the other travellers on the road?" He let out a sigh. "Not entirely." She could tell he didn't want to explain further, but some part of him felt compelled to do so all the same. At any rate, he found it difficult to stop once he'd started, as if each new word was a splinter deeply embedded, a collection of tiny hurts that he'd longed to pull free. "My little brother, Emery, was never quite right in the head," he began softly. "After my parents died, it was just the two of us. It fell upon me to raise him, but I didn't mind. I loved that boy with all my heart. But our pack, they saw it differently. In a flash, that unchallenged beauty hardened into something more distant. There was a grim set to his mouth, and all those easy morning smiles faded suddenly away. Wolves aren't like other men. He paused abruptly, then amended just as fast. Or perhaps they are too like them, and that is the problem. They told me to take care of it. She blinked in confusion. Then a dawning horror swept over her face. But they can't have meant... He nodded curtly. A pack must function efficiently. There is no room for confusion or error. It's a single unit, always has been. Only the strongest survive. Despite the warmth that had gathered between them under the cloak, she suddenly felt just as cold as the previous night. A shiver of dread crept up her back, and all at once she realized that she didn't want to hear how the story was going to end. They weren't going to make me do it myself. They had at least that much compassion. They sent me away instead, to run supplies to another village. When I found out what they were planning, I cut straight back through the forest. Of course, by then, it was already too late. His face went very still, as if he'd stepped out of the sun. They were still in my house when I returned, standing over his body. I remember one of them looked up in surprise, said they didn't think I'd be back so soon. A pair of tears slipped down her face, but he was cold and remote. I flew into a rage when I saw it, lost all sense of myself. Killed 3 men. There was a pause. Killed 3 wolves, he amended suddenly, lips curving with a humorless smile. And the pack cannot forgive such a thing. I was banished from the village, to roam forever after by myself. And just like that, the story was over. He pushed brusquely to his feet, and a rush of frigid air swept between them, blanketing her from head to toe. She shivered and gathered the cloak around her, staring up at him in silence. There was nothing she could say in response to such a thing. It was a hurt so deep the goal was never to heal, only to find a way to get through it. Instead of trying, she merely considered the things she already knew. The cave, the skittish instincts, the things he'd said offhandedly. It's a kind of shock. It will pass, in time. You find ways to honor him, she murmured softly, gazing up in the dim light. I saw you putting astrolabe beneath the tree the other morning, whispering something, like you were at a grave. He visibly hesitated, still facing the opposite direction. A few days ago, he might have hurried them past it, but things had changed since then. It was a prayer, he answered quietly. My mother taught me before she passed. I taught it to him as well. It has been 1 year to the day. She let out a breath, feeling an ache of sympathy deep in her chest. I'm so sorry. He smiled without looking, picturing someone else. He would have been 11, finally tall enough to use the saddle I bought him. You bought him a saddle? She repeated in surprise. She didn't know much about Jesse's village, but from the bits she'd gleaned along their journey, it sounded almost as impoverished as her own. The leather must have cost a fortune. His eyes lit up with a nostalgic spark. He loved horses, loved them. He'd stand on the side of the road for hours waiting for a wagon to pass. There was this one morning. He caught himself abruptly, glancing back to see her watching with a mirrored smile. Tell me, she prompted. That nostalgia dimmed before fading from his eyes. It does no good to speak of it. He let out a quiet breath before circling back, kneeling down beside her fledgling attempts at a fire. For a while his hands rummaged through the pieces almost absent-mindedly. Then he lifted his head suddenly, staring into her eyes. There is more I must tell you, he confessed. The men I killed, It was the packmaster's son and 2 others. The punishment for this exceeds mere banishment. If any of them were ever to find me, they would kill me on the spot. Marked for death by a pack of wolves. If she was given infinite time, she couldn't think of a worse sentence. Packs had a long reach and an even longer memory. There was no way to escape their ledger once one found themselves on its page. Every day thereafter was simply a waiting game, placing one's life in the hands of fate. What a pair we make. She considered for a suspended moment before pushing to her feet. Then we mustn't let them find you. He blinked up at her, staring like he was sure he'd misheard. After a few seconds, when she said nothing to retract it, he tilted his head to the side, staring with a truly indecipherable expression. You're extremely trusting pretty fast. There was an edge to his voice, and he regarded her almost suspiciously. It is a blasphemy what I did, to spill the blood of my own pack. She raised her eyebrows, waiting for more. There are some who might say it doesn't speak well of me. Well, they would be wrong, she said briskly, pushing to her feet. I may not have travelled far, but I know people. I've spent my whole life watching them. Their eyes met for a fraction of a moment. You're a good person, Jessie. I'm sure if your brother was here, he'd tell you the same. With that, she tied back her hair and started bustling around the clearing, taking stock of their meagre supplies, pulling more pieces of kindling from beneath the surrounding ferns. It took her a minute to realize he was still watching. You are unlike anyone I've ever met before, he murmured. A person all to yourself. True to character, he meant nothing beyond exactly what he said. It was a thoughtful observation, nothing more. But she didn't know if she'd ever received such a compliment. Her cheeks flamed, but she kept her head down, gathering things for the fire. I imagine there will be many like me at the stronghold. He stared a second longer, then pushed to his feet with a smile. I guess we'll find out. We? She repeated with a touch of surprise. You're coming with me? Aside from that little mishap with the river, I was actually doing pretty well on my own. Would you like me to come or not? She bit her lip, hiding a smile. Only if you want to. There was a pause. Only if you want me to. Another pause. All right, she said lightly, skipping off into the trees. If you insist. Once the plan was decided, the pair settled down before a roaring fire, greedily soaking in all that scorching heat they'd been missing so desperately the day before. Despite the pressing nature of their journey, they took their time, managing their battered bodies with an uncharacteristic care. They made bandages from strips of cloth and poultices from the tiny flowers growing alongside the river. Jessie trapped a rabbit that they roasted over the open flames. It was the first substantial thing they'd had in days, and they passed it back and forth until it was nothing but bone. But the thing Kiera remembered most was the talking. There was nothing but talking. You're the only shifter I've known, she said importantly, lifting her arms for balance as she walked the length of a fallen log. The camp had been packed up and they were hiking now, only another day from the stronghold. There was a man who worked for me named Marcel. Of course, the magic ran in only half his blood. His mother was a wolf, his father was a man. Jessie nodded absent-mindedly, lifting a hand to steady her when she started to fall. An unlikely pairing, that usually doesn't work. She flashed him a curious look, but decided to save that particular question for later. I never saw him shift, she concluded. I asked him once, but he refused. I'm not surprised. We're not ponies. Jessie battered away an overhanging branch, flashing her a wry grin. We don't do tricks upon command. That's a real shame. She was about to say as much when he pulled in a sharp breath, lifting a hand to his shoulder. It was the same arm that had been caught in those deadly rocks, trapping him on the riverbed, While the laceration was healing beneath an herbal balm, the joint had been torn loose. "I'm sorry," she murmured, with a sympathetic grimace. He hadn't let her examine it the night before. Not that she'd have had the courage to look. "What would you do under different circumstances? If you were back in your village, how would such a thing be treated?" He merely shook his head, clutching the shoulder with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "They would probably just..." He shook his head again. "I don't know how they treat it." Perhaps if he'd come up with a better lie, she might have swallowed it. Or perhaps if she hadn't looked at his face. As it stood, she hopped off the log and landed in front of him. "That's nonsense. You must know. Surely you have been injured before, or you've known people with similar afflictions. Packs are all about community. What would they have done to heal you?" He opened his mouth with a snappish reply, but it died on his lips. "I would have shifted." She froze in surprise, staring up at him. At first, she thought he was merely playing into the conversation they'd been having just before, setting her up for another joke about ponies. But a single look at that glowering expression, and she knew without question it was true. He would heal better as a wolf? "Oh, all right." She bit down on her lip, trying to hide the sudden flutter of excitement in her chest. "Well, just do that. We can take a quick break. Let you romp around the forest." A strange look clouded his eyes before he shook his head sharply. "Can you help me set it?" "What? No. Of course," she replied quickly, trying to shut down the accompanying panic. Regardless that she'd grown up alongside a notoriously dangerous forest, she'd never been great when it came to such matters. She set down the satchel she'd been carrying. "Just show me what to do." He nodded curtly and motioned her toward a tree, bracing himself against the base and angling his shoulder. "You see that bone there?" She nodded. "You must push it back into alignment." "I'm going to faint." "Absolutely," she echoed, nodding at lightning speed. "Easy." Nothing happened. "Right now?" He flashed her a quick look, torn between a grimace and a smile. Yes, right now. Unless another time might be more convenient." "Actually, sure," she said again, taking a step forward. "I'll just do it right now." She stepped into position, laying a tentative hand upon his arm. The lean muscles curved just beneath the surface, providing a graceful line for her to follow. It was easy to pinpoint the damage. Trying to fix the damage was another matter entirely. "All right," she determined, sucking in a breath and fighting the urge to close her eyes. "On 3? "You don't need to count, just do it." 1, 2... Wait a second. She took a sudden step back, eyes flickering with panic. "Is there going to be any blood?" He stared back with a trace of disbelief. "Seriously?" Silence. "It's all beneath the skin, Kiera. You're pulling bones." "Right, of course. I just wanted to be sure." She pushed back her hair, feeling a little lightheaded. "In case we needed towels, you know. Not that we have any towels. Shall I do this myself?" "No," she said quickly. "No, I can do it." There was a beat. "That's really brave of you." "Shut up." "All right, here it goes. No countdown." Without another word, she sucked in a breath and pushed hard exactly where he had told her, closing her eyes with the force of it, waiting to feel that telltale pop. It never happened. He cursed instead. "Damn it, Kiera, I was bloody joking!" He flashed her a furious look. "You didn't have to..." "I didn't do that on purpose," she cried, horrified that he'd even consider it. "You think I'd torture you as some kind of game?" He closed his eyes, rubbing at the tender joint. "No, apparently you do it for some other reason." "Jessie, just try again." She nodded quickly, trying hard not to cry. but still the bone wouldn't budge. It was simply too far out of alignment, and she didn't have the strength to force it back. A painful breath escaped his lips while his body trembled with anticipation, aching to rip itself apart and be reborn anew. He knows what to do, so why am I playing doctor? Jessie, I can't. You can, he interrupted quickly, setting his face against the pain. Try again, please. She did. Twice more. But neither attempt had any success. The only thing she managed to do was turn his skin a frightful shade of pale. Instead of trying again, she dropped her arm to her side. This is ridiculous. Why can't you just shift? It's not ridiculous, he answered, trying to catch his breath. Just give it one more. Jessie, I'm not strong enough. You need to... I'm not going to shift. The words echoed between them, punctuated with 2 sets of shallow breaths. She didn't know what to make of them, and he instantly regretted saying them out loud. After only a moment, he broke her gaze. I don't feel right about it. It's complicated. She stared back in amazement. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, that was the very bottom of the list. And yet there wasn't any anger in it. Not by the end. There was nothing but pain and something very sad. Chapter 9. Kiera didn't end up fixing Jessie's shoulder that day. After a few more failed attempts, he reached his pain threshold, and she had no breath left to apologize. Instead, they continued on their endless journey, winding along the forest trails, talking in quiet voices as the sun rose in the sky above them and sank slowly beneath the trees. For a girl who'd grown up without friends or family, it was a completely new sensation, and considering her life in the tavern was spent in forced conversation, she'd never had anything like it. Jessie was fun. It wasn't the first thing you'd notice about him. The man had crafted a very different persona, one that didn't exactly encourage people to get closer and discover the rest. But it didn't take long for those deflections to fade, for those monosyllabic dismissals to stretch into longer answers, and for that brisk stride of his to slow and allow her to walk alongside. There was a playfulness about him that defied expectation, one that stood like a defiant flag in the midst of all the childhood tragedy that might have made him stern and grim. He whistled, without realizing it. He threw a pine cone at her head, then blamed whatever rodent happened to be nearby. When she cut her hand trying to extract a handful of nuts from a bristly sapling, he ripped a piece of his shirt to bandage it, then attacked the tree in question with such theatric ferocity that she doubled over laughing and was completely unable to catch her breath. She would share a memory from her childhood. He would share one of his. She would announce that she'd spotted a brilliant shortcut, and he'd followed her indulgently to the bottom of whatever gully or ravine she trapped them in, laughing uproariously as he got them back out. It was an interesting dynamic, one where neither one of them exactly pulled their punches, one that was ever challenging and ever changing, carrying them into something new. We should probably make camp here for the night, he finally suggested, once the sun had fallen beneath the lowest branches of the trees. He cast a glance around the forest before flashing her a quick grin. Unless you've got any more brilliant ideas up your sleeve. She deliberately ignored this, dropping the pack in the middle of the clearing and wrapping her arms immediately around her chest. It's freezing tonight. He nodded vaguely, squinting up at the sky. Been like this for a while now. It's the coldest spring I can remember. Not the best time to have lost one's clothes. The shoe situation had become an almost comedic problem. Twice a day he would force them to stop and build a fire, warming some feeling back into her numbed feet. At one point, he took off his own massive boots and insisted she try them on. The ensuing catastrophe had been one that neither could have predicted, and both had vowed to keep secret until the grave. That's all right, she said brightly, forcing a little bit of cheer. "We'll be at the stronghold tomorrow. Then, with any luck, we can start sleeping indoors. If you stay with me. If they decide to take either one of us along." "We might lose our edge," he warned. "At the very least, we'll have to sleep on the floor." She laughed under her breath, scanning around for the thickest bed of pine needles before settling beneath the boughs of a large tree. The fire was already crackling, casting a golden glow on the woods around them. It clung to the trees like a flickering halo, melting slowly into a sea of stars. He hesitated for a split second, then settled down beside her, forsaking their usual barrier of distance and lying right next to her side. "Is this all right?" he asked softly, his eyes on the sky. "Like you said, it's freezing." She nestled closer, tucking her body into his side. From that point on, such a thing was never questioned. The two of them folded into each other, making tiny adjustments until it was a perfect fit. Oddly enough, it wasn't nearly as awkward as it might have been, quite possibly because of the icy breeze whispering along their back. But the front of them was warm, held close and safe by another. "What about the signals?" she whispered with a grin. He glanced down at the top of her head. "What are you talking about?" "The signals," she repeated, quoting his earlier question. "I might be out of practice, but should I be picking up on something here?" His body shook with silent laughter. "I'm not worried about the signals. You might be a fearless adventurer, but we've already established that I'm rather feeble. Surely you wouldn't be interested in anything like that." "Surely not." The next morning came faster than either of them would have preferred, and that cozy feeling of security had vanished with the dawn. By the time Kiera opened her eyes, he was already standing beside the fire, arms folded, staring with a troubled frown into the brightening skies. "Good morning," she called softly. He startled, then turned around. "Morning." He flashed a tight smile. "You want some breakfast?" She shook her head, studying him instead. "What's the matter?" "Nothing," he replied quickly, tossing another log onto the fire. "Are you sure about breakfast? I can find something before we—" "What's the matter?" she asked again, joining him by the fire. "I know the weather has been unseasonable and game has been scarce, but the journey is nearly over. We're almost to the Fae stronghold." He stared a moment, then turned back to the horizon. "Exactly. We're almost to the Fae." She came up short beside him, suddenly unsure what to say. After a few seconds of rather awkward silence, he glanced down at her again, then raked his hair back with a sigh. "The stronghold belongs to the Fae, but it's also the largest settlement on this side of the Eastern Mountains. It's a center for trade and commerce. People of all kinds journey for weeks just to step through its gates." He hesitated a moment, unwilling to say the rest. "It's the perfect place for you to seek counsel. I'm only worried that—" Her lips parted in sudden understanding. "You're worried about running into your pack?" His head bowed to his chest. "They've been there many times before. Is the reason I know of it." He opened his mouth to say something else, then shrugged stiffly, as if it didn't matter either way. "It has no bearing on what happens next. It was just a passing thought." She stepped beside him with a shiver, following his gaze to the horizon. "Perhaps I could go in alone." "I would never leave you alone in such a place." This was said without compromise. She didn't challenge it. "Do you think—" She trailed off, suddenly wishing they were still asleep. "I mean, if your pack was there and they spotted you, do you think the Fae would turn you over?" He shook his head, looking abruptly grim. They might just carry out the sentence themselves. Her mind rebelled at the very thought. They wouldn't do that. Would they? Historically speaking, the Fae held themselves apart from the affairs of mortals, but they had been known to deliver their own brand of justice when the situation arose. When the Midland farmers had an entire year's harvest stolen by bandits, they'd sent a plea for help in every direction. Those same bandits turned up a day later at the bottom of a river. The farmers awoke the next morning to baskets of vegetables and grain. A few summers after that, a wandering sorcerer had been terrorizing a group of schoolchildren. The villagers found pieces of him hanging from various trees. They wouldn't do that, Kiera repeated firmly, although secretly she wasn't so sure. From the way it had been described, living in the shadow of the Fae was something akin to having a slightly disinterested fairy godmother, the kind who was prone to occasional fits of rage. He's been going out of his way to hide from them. He's been living in a freaking cave, and now he's waltzing straight into the nearest settlement with a crazed redhead on his arm, shouting about dragons. She cast him a sideways glance. Those fishermen you were meeting. I was hoping they'd allow me to travel with them downstream, he replied shortly. Wolves can't follow a scent over water. I thought it might buy me a little time. The two of them fell silent, staring vacantly over the trees. The gate is the main point of congestion, he finally murmured. It would be better if we could slip inside unnoticed. At any rate, the remainder of the journey would be difficult. The Fae did not build within the trees, but in the curve of a valley. The path is made from gravel and stone. She nodded blankly, then flashed a look at her bare feet. Oh. It was quiet for a few minutes longer, as each of them silently considered their options. In all honesty, it wasn't a difficult problem. One of them needed to seek out the stronghold, the other needed to avoid it at all costs. Yet strangely enough, at no point did either one of them even consider splitting up. They weighed every alternative instead, repeatedly coming up blank. You could always drape some ferns over your head and carry me, she suggested with a helpless smile. I've only been asking for the last 30 miles. She'd meant it as a joke, but it looked as though he was seriously considering. Probably not the shrubbery, but the chance to save what remained of her feet. That same hapless look came over him, and he'd just opened his mouth to reply, when the quiet broke with the sudden creak of wheels. Not the time. He threw out an arm, but she was already crouching out of sight, peering out from the underbrush as a wagon rolled slowly down the road. It was pulled by 2 horses, expensive horses, which was enough of a rarity, and the man driving it wasn't exactly keeping a low profile. I've got me a fishmonger's wife, I did say, the very fishmonger who sold me this bay. The pair froze perfectly still, staring in silence through the ferns. It wasn't just that the man was singing, he was also dancing as much as his perch upon the cart would allow. The reins swung wildly back and forth with each wave of his hands, confusing the poor horses, and a half-empty bottle of spirits teetered precariously on the wood beneath him. I cut off her legs, threw her to sea, then she turned to a mermaid and forgot all of me. Jesse took a single look, then shook his head. We can go around. At once, the music stopped. Who's there? Kiera's eyes flashed up in shock as the man pulled hard upon the reins, bringing the wagon to an abrupt stop. It didn't seem possible that he could have heard anything. They were a good distance away. Jesse had spoken softly, and the man had been wailing at the top of his lungs. Not only had he come to an immediate pause, but he was staring at their precise location, those whiskey-glazed eyes sharpening with sudden intensity as they pierced through the trees. Crap! She flashed a panicked look at Jesse, but found no help. He was frozen dead still, lips half-parted in surprise. For a split second, it looked like he was considering simply grabbing her and vanishing into the trees. But something about the deliberate line of the man's gaze held him there. After a few seconds, he stepped forward and said, It was such a lovely tune, we couldn't bring ourselves to interrupt. Brilliant strategy. Antagonize the man. A charged silence fell over the road as the pair stepped out from the trees. It grew worse with every second it was allowed to continue, threatening to break in a way that was beyond repair. Then, all at once, the man let out a bark of laughter. "Care to show me how it's done?" Kiera relaxed ever so slightly, then smacked Jessie upside the head. "What?" he breathed. "He's laughing, isn't he?" She gave him a cold look. "This is why you have no friends." "Come on out of there," the man called, waving them forward. The bottle teetered between his boots, and he caught it with a loud hiccup. "My bite is nothing compared to my bark." Processing. "We're sorry not to have shown ourselves earlier," Jessie answered politely, as the two stepped onto the path. "You can never be too careful on these roads." A well-known sentiment, yet it seemed completely lost on their audience. Not only had the man spent the last 20 miles serenading the unfortunate forest creatures, but the wagon he drove was the biggest, loudest, most attention-grabbing cart that Kiera had ever seen. There were swoops of colour, bells and whistles. For a split second, she was convinced he'd escaped from some kind of travelling carnival, but the cart and the horses appeared to be his own. "Well, you could afford to be a little less careful, couldn't you?" the man replied with a sly grin, looking him up and down. "A young man such as yourself, I'd wager there aren't many things in those woods that could frighten the likes of you." "He knows?" Kiera froze in amazement. "How does he know?" She threw a glance at Jessie, prepared to take her cue from him, but he was regarding the man with the hint of a smile, tilting his head with a curious, "And yourself?" The man threw back his head with another jovial laugh. "I might be one of the exceptions." It was scarcely a comfort, but Jessie walked forward without a trace of fear, patting one of the horses on the neck as he came to a stop beside the wagon. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with deep grooves from the wheels of 1,000 similar carts. "Where are you heading?" "To Farian," the man replied briskly, extending the bottle with his free hand. When he saw their blank faces, he added, "There is a stronghold of Fae only a half a day's journey from here." "Farian," Kiera warmed with anticipation. "I never knew its name." "You wouldn't be happening to travel in the same direction, would you?" he continued curiously, eyeing them up and down. "Not too much else around these parts." The friends hesitated, then decided to share. "We've been heading that way for the last few days," Jessie admitted. "It's been a bit slow moving at times. The storm washed away most of the forest paths." I heard about that," the man replied, nodding along. "The trails in the foothills have all but vanished, and the only way to cross the river is now leagues away." "You could always fall in." "You've been travelling alongside him," he continued, glancing at Kiera with a hint of surprise. "Little thing like yourself." His eyes flashed, and her hands ached for her cleaver, but Jessie was quick to intervene. "She's tougher than she looks," he said casually, standing tall beside her. "Brilliant sense of direction. Just a few nights ago, she actually saved my life." She threw him a look, trying hard not to smile, while the man muttered under his breath, "I won't ask how she did that." "We're sorry to have startled you," Jessie concluded, stepping back towards the trees. "Safe travels. Perhaps we'll see you in Farian." The man lifted a hand in farewell, then stopped himself just as fast. It might have been a camaraderie amongst shifters. It might have been the sight of two young people alone on the road. It might have been simply that they'd heard him singing. "Could we not simply travel together?" he asked abruptly, picking up the bottle and lowering the reins to his lap. "We're all going to the same place, are we not?" Jessie's eyebrows rose in surprise, while Kiera shook her head. "That's very kind," she said sweetly, "but I think we'll continue on by ourselves." The man said nothing to contest this. He simply regarded her from the cart. "You going to walk the rest of the way there on bare feet?" "Maybe." Jessie looked at him carefully, trying to decide if the offer was real. "I haven't any coin." The man shrugged this off with a laugh, gesturing to the cart. "The name's Fergus. Does it look like I need any coin?" The laughter quieted when he saw the look on the young man's face. "Not that you'd ride for free. Can you hunt?" He gestured to the blade hanging from Jesse's belt. "You any good with that thing?" There was a beat of silence. "Yes." "Then hunt." Without another word, the man steered the wagon off the road, hopped down onto the grass, and hoisted his portly feet upon the rock. The horses began grazing. He took another swig from the bottle. It wasn't until he saw their guarded expressions that he gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Take the girl with you if you like. I have no interest." There was a swig of whiskey, echoed by a truly memorable belch. "Just don't come back unless you have venison." A few minutes later, Kiera and Jesse were back in the woods. "I can't believe you just agreed to this," she said incredulously, shadowing after him. "You who are always so careful. You who didn't want to risk taking that delightful bridge." He released a branch early, swinging it into her face. "Fergus isn't so bad. Besides, the man's a shifter." She flashed a look at the back of his head. "Take it from a girl who worked in a tavern. The world could use fewer shifters." "But how did he know that you're a shifter?" she asked suddenly. "It's like he just looked at you and somehow knew." He shrugged, easing his way through the ferns. "You kind of get a sense for these things. It's how he was able to spot us so easily. He carries that gift himself." "Yes, but he's not a wolf," she said excitedly, circling ahead of him. "What do you think he meant? That he's one of the few things that might be able to scare you? What does he shift into?" "Male pattern baldness?" She snorted with laughter, falling back into his footsteps. It truly was a marvel, watching how he moved in the woods. Of course, it made a lot more sense now that she knew he was a shifter, but the wonder of it remained the same. It was as if the walls between man and forest simply dissolved, bending into each other like extensions of the same thing. When he crouched down low, the woods seemed to gather up around him. When he ghosted noiselessly along the trails, his feet barely touched the ground. He saw the deer ages before she did. He was already raising the knife when she spotted it through the trees. "Wait!" She grabbed his arm as two creatures startled and vanished into the woods. The blade caught the tips of his fingers, spinning impatiently back into his hand. "What the heck was that?" he demanded, gesturing with his free hand. "It was right! It was a mother," she interrupted indignantly. "Did you not see the fawn?" He stared at her for a moment, biting the inside of his lip. It looked as though there were several things he'd like to say, but he simply pushed to his feet and offered her a hand. The two continued moving forward. "You must have been a nightmare back home," he murmured as they walked beneath the sunlit canopy, luring strays out of the forest, crying each winter at the loss of the sun. She smacked him with a grin. "I was a delight back home, I'll have you know, and for the record, it's impossibly insensitive for you to be mentioning the place, seeing as I no longer have a home to go back to." "We are on equal footing in that regard," he answered cheerfully. "Neither do I." "That's a fair point." They continued walking a ways longer, before he shot her a sideways glance. "A delight, huh?" He pursed his lips, as if he found it unlikely. "A lovely girl working in a tavern. I bet they couldn't get enough." She glanced over sharply, but he flashed an easy smile. "They must have been falling over themselves just to make you notice." "Where is this coming from?" Her cheeks flamed, and she kept her eyes on the trail. "That's not the easiest thing in a small village," she answered. "When you grow up in such a limited space, seeing the same people every day, it doesn't inspire much of a spark." He nodded thoughtfully, unaware she was watching every move. "But you must know how that is," she prompted. "I'm sure there's some ferocious she-wolf out there who'd like nothing more than to rip out my—" He caught her suddenly by the cloak, pulling her out of sight. It was a young stag, one who'd already been injured somehow, because it limped into the clearing ahead of them with a distinct lack of grace. Jesse reached slowly for the knife. "It's your lucky day," he breathed. "A mercy killing. Don't go scaring it off." She held her tongue and looked away, hearing a quiet swish behind her as his knife sliced through the air. It was a clean kill, over in less than a second, just a swift flick of the blade. Jesse straightened up slowly, eyes locked on the trees. "Sorry about that. What were you saying?" She stared at him a moment, then shook her head. "I've completely forgotten." Fergus was thrilled. The man might have collected every trinket under the sun, but he longed for meat. And whatever unseen horror he might shift into, he was clearly too lazy to find it for himself. After bartering a little for the skin, Jesse agreed to let him have it in exchange for a few coins, enough to buy a pair of shoes and a new cloak once they reached the stronghold. Kiera wouldn't have turned down a dress or pants, or even a blade of her own, but she said nothing. At any rate, there would be little reason to arm herself once they arrived. The Fae would take care of everything, for better or worse. That's what they did. If they believe me. "Are you going to finish that?" She looked down to see Fergus eyeing the slab of venison in her hand. Truth be told, having seen the animal once alive, she couldn't muster much of an appetite. The only reason she'd eaten as much as she did was the not-so-subtle look Jessie was giving her across the fire. "Not at all," she offered, tossing it over. "Help yourself." He caught it with a flick of his hand, then swallowed half of it in a single snappish bite, something she was reading too much into. Something that looked suspiciously like a... His eyes twinkled with mischief. "You'll never guess." "Come on," she cried, laughing in spite of herself. "Just tell me." He shook his head, licking the grease off his fingers. "Up into the cart, little lady. We've only got a few hours to go." She might have protested more, but the prospect of sitting down somewhere comfortable and having the miles disappear beneath her was a prospect too inviting to ignore. With a final punishing glance, she kicked some dirt over the fire, then climbed up into the cart after Jessie, and froze. What the... It was as if the circus she'd imagined earlier had somehow been shrunk down to fit inside the four walls of the wagon. One couldn't move an inch without striking their head upon the half-melted candles, the piles of dried herbs. There were books, toys, jewellery, sweets. There were enough scarves and curtains to effectively pave the way to the stronghold if they tired of the dirt. "He wasn't lying," she murmured, climbing inside. "He doesn't need the coin." Jessie nodded along, forsaking the cluttered bench and settling on the floor. She sank down beside him, lurching forward as the horses trotted forward and the cart began to move. It wasn't an easy journey, jostling about with the bottles and swinging lanterns, but it was certainly better than walking, and it made for endless hours of entertainment examining the wares. "So, he means to sell this at the stronghold?" she asked curiously, picking up a tincture and giving it a delicate sniff. "He means to barter it off to the Fae?" She couldn't imagine it would seem like anything more than trinkets and prairie herbs in their immortal eyes, but what did she know? She'd never been so far from her village. "I think he means to set it aflame," Jessie teased, drumming his fingers against the empty barrel of mead. "An ancient form of woodland performance art." "I heard that," a voice called from the front. "And don't touch anything. I have everything counted, and if anything is missing when we arrive, I'll take payment in the form of a hand." Kiera and Jessie glanced towards the front, then flashed each other a grin. "I don't care whose." With those words echoing in his ears, Jessie secured the canvas flap between them and slipped a small bottle of whiskey up his sleeve. "What are you doing?" Kiera mouthed in dismay. "Put it back." His eyes danced with mischief as he cocked his head with a frown. "What?" She smacked him with a grin. "It's going to be your hand. Oh, relax, he breathed, taking a quick swig. You've seen how the guys drink. I probably just added another year to his life. Another swig, this one much longer. Besides, we could always use it to barter with our new companions. They say Fae are known for their love of drink. The smile melted from her face as her eyes drifted towards the crack in the canvas. What do you think they're going to say? She twisted her fingers nervously, realizing all at once that she'd been deliberately avoiding that very question. Do you think they'll take us along? He flashed her a quick look. They'll take you. You were the only one who saw the thing. Her heart quickened in sudden panic. What about you? Over the course of a single week, her world had been forever shaken. Daily routines and future plans had been upended. All the people and places that had grounded her vanished in a burst of fire. It had been enough to send anyone over the edge, but she'd had a single tether. He raised his eyes slowly, meeting her gaze. I could come along, if you like. She stared a moment, then nodded. Yes, I'd like that. They rode on for a while longer, napping occasionally, drinking occasionally, watching the shadows of 1,000 trinkets dance across the canvas as the sun travelled across the sky. Outside the wagon, the world was quickly changing. The sounds and smells of the forest had tapered off, then vanished entirely. The ground smoothed, giving way to open air. There isn't anyone, he said suddenly. No she-wolf ready to rip out your throat. She stared at him for a moment, then lowered her eyes to the ground. There isn't anyone for me either. There never has been. And everyone I've ever known just died. Their gazes met briefly, then flew in opposite directions, trying to find anywhere to settle as the air in the wagon seemed to heat up and thin. You said that you wouldn't shift, she blurted. He eyed her warily, waiting for the rest. I asked about your shoulder, and you said that you wouldn't change into a wolf, that you didn't feel right about it. She paused. But you shifted before, when I fell into the river. He opened his mouth, then looked away. That was different. Why? She pressed. Because it was so sudden. Because it was you. A sudden hush fell between them. A suspended moment when the two of them locked eyes. It started small, in little gestures. He leaned closer, and she straightened to be closer to his height. He tilted his head, and she lifted her chin. It could almost have been accidental. It could not have been more intentioned. Then, a moment before their lips could touch. Pardon the intrusion. They pulled back at the speed of light, settling into their separate corners as the canvas was lifted and Fergus appeared in the doorway, regarding them with an unbearable smile. I can come back in a few minutes if you'd like some time. Kiera blushed to high heaven, while Jesse leveled the guy with a hard look. What is it? He demanded. Why have we stopped? The man pulled the canvas back farther, gesturing outside. We're here. Chapter 10. Armed with nothing but fairy tales and very little fact, Kiera found herself ill-equipped for what lay ahead. With the hesitant curiosity of a child, she and Jessie leaned forward, peering out from the open wagon and into an entirely different world. When Jessie said the Fae had built not in the woods, but a valley, she hadn't realized what they'd constructed had become a part of the valley itself. While it kept to the basic principles she'd seen before, walls for security, various roofs to keep out the rain, nearly everything else about the settlement would have been better suited to the pages of a story. There was an otherworldly quality that didn't belong to the grit and grime she was used to, but must have originated someplace else. The perimeter itself seemed not just to cordon off an area of land, but to rest upon it like a crown, embellished with curves and flourishes that she had never seen people take the time to create anywhere else. There was a beauty to it, that she had never associated with a building. Even the materials they used were something different, smooth as they were strong, catching the rays of light with a lustrous shine. The gate was wide open, beckoning one inside. The archers on the ramparts told a different story. "Should we be worried about them?" Jessie asked nervously as the cart rolled closer. Fergus followed his gaze, then waved it off with a dismissive, "Bah! It is nothing but a precaution," he replied. "We are technically strangers. This is technically their home." Nonetheless, he tipped his hat respectfully as they rolled through the gate. "Not that they actually consider us a threat." "And why would they?" Kiera lifted her head in wonder, staring with eyes like saucers as they cleared the doors and slowed to a gradual stop inside. Never could she have imagined such a place. Each way she looked was more dazzling than the last, from the splendor and brightness to the delicate symmetry of the aesthetic, right down to the sheer scale. This for an outpost on what some might call a forgotten corner of the world. There were rows of pristine houses, gardens and fountains, brightly coloured storefronts with merchandise she'd never seen in her life. In the distance, she could have sworn she glimpsed an actual library, and every spare inch had been planted with flowering trees. Even the ground had been given a glossy finish, paving over the dirt that spanned the rest of the realm with carefully hewn panels of smooth grey stone. She stepped carefully out of the wagon, tracing one with her toe. All at once, she was hyper-aware that she was barefoot and naked beneath her cloak. All at once, she was hyper-aware that she'd been travelling for over a week in the wilderness, sleeping on the dirt and washing in the river, and had yet to glimpse a reflection of her own face. "I'm sure it's fine." The only point of solace was that, for the first time in her life, she was in a place so busy that not a single person was looking. She was yet another girl standing beside yet another wagon. The streets were full of them, and there were many more interesting things to catch one's eye. Alongside the stately architecture of the Fae, a bustling outdoor market had emerged, a magical hodgepodge teeming with the sorts of creatures Kiera had longed most to see. There were covens of witches selling elixirs and jars of scented honey. Clusters of pixies shimmered like iridescent clouds, hovering just out of reach. A handful of goblins wove their way through the jostling crowd, standing high as a man's kneecap and reaching for stray pocketbooks, while packs of men and shifters roved amongst the booths, clutching pints of brandy and ale. Kiera stood on the tips of her toes, searching the crowd. Then, all at once, "Is that—" She trailed into silence, staring at a pair of men at the edge of the market. One was clearly a shifter. He was young and handsome, yet ordinary, with hair strung with the same braids she'd seen packs of wolves wearing before. The man he was speaking to was something quite different. "Ah, yes," Fergus grinned, coming to stand beside her. "So you've finally seen one." He plopped an arm atop her shoulders, following her gaze. The shifter was clearly enamoured, starstruck and stuttering, trying desperately to keep pace with the conversation. The Fae gave him an enchanting smile, resting a light hand upon his arm. "Fae are very welcoming, if they decide to take a liking to you." She shot him a curious look, then watched as the pair laughed at something inconsequential and wandered off into the crowd. It had always been to her supreme disappointment as she hadn't seen one already. Just a single time had a Fae come to the tavern, but she'd seen only the cluster of people who'd gathered round them, and never glimpsed the immortal themselves. "I suggest you gather your wits before going any further," Fergus continued, spotting a band of fellow merchants on the far side of the square. "Plenty of questionable characters in this lot." His eyes twinkled as Jessie hopped out of the wagon behind her. "Although something tells me it won't come to any harm." Without another word, he gave them both a jolly wave and cut straight through the centre of the crowd, leading the horses by the reins and singing with abandon as he went. I once knew a fairy who choked on a berry and ended up pickled in brine. She and Jessie stared after him, hearing echoes of his voice long after he was gone. If we're being honest, I think he's a touch mad. She turned with a grin for confirmation, but froze at the look on his face. See anyone familiar? He shook his head, eyes roving through the crowd. But I probably wouldn't, not before they saw me. A shiver of dread ran up her spine. In that case, we'd better hurry. She stretched up on her toes once again, scanning around the market with fresh determination. How does one usually do this? Do we just walk up to someone and ask? Even as she said the words, a door flung open in a nearby tavern, and another fae stepped onto the street. This one looked much different than the other, while having the same ethereal quality that set him apart from the rest. He was beautiful, that much was obvious, but it was a cold beauty, austere and ever-changing in the little tricks of light. No matter how hard she tried, it was impossible to pin him down one way or another. In some shades he was a young man. In others, one could imagine the endless passage of time. Could he be a warrior, a painting, an ally, a friend? Something in his eyes made her doubt he'd often been called such a thing. Nevertheless, she took a single look and started heading towards him, dragging Jessie along by the wrist. "Excuse me," she stumbled into his path. "I was wondering if you—" It was a moment she would never quite live down, but the instant the two of them locked eyes, she found herself just as dumbstruck and speechless as the shifter they'd seen before. Instead of finishing the question, she merely stood there, staring up at him in a daze. He must be a prince, or perhaps a great lord. Nothing else could suit him. Her mouth opened slowly, but no words would come. When this is all finished, I wonder if he'd let me draw him. After a few seconds, the fae tilted his head. Is she unwell? Jessie kicked her sharply. I'm sorry, she stammered, blushing to the roots of her hair. I don't mean to impose, it's just something's happened and we need to... is there a place that we could... How should I say it? Jessie cleared his throat. We need to speak with someone about a dragon. That works. The fae raised his eyebrows in surprise, staring with such an expression that Kiera was abruptly convinced there was a forum for such things, rather than just accosting a random man on the street. A dragon? He repeated slowly, staring at each of them in turn. Are you writing a book? Her cheeks flamed, but she managed to push through. Just a few days ago, a dragon burned down my entire village. I was in the forest when it happened and saw the creature with my own eyes. A single breath and waves of liquid fire rained down from the heavens. Not a single man, woman, or child survived. A heavy silence rang between them, one that stood in stark contrast to the cheerful bustle on the street. She held her breath and tried to keep steady, determined not to be the one to break. Please, please say you believe me. The fae stared at them for a very long time. An immortal people, he and his kin didn't seem to register silences and pauses the way others did. His eyes dilated as he played back each word. Then, at last, his mouth curved with a smile. I have exactly the person. And just like that, he started walking. Kiera cast a breathless look at Jessie, then hurried after him, struggling to keep pace with his long and graceful strides. The feeling of relief was overwhelming, almost lifting her straight off her feet. Not until that very moment did she realize that she'd expected them not to believe her, and that if she managed to make it to the stronghold at all. Yet, here she was, following in the footsteps of a man who'd just promised to lead her to a savior. The journey had not been in vain. There would finally be some immortal retribution for all those stolen lives. The moment she knew it for certain, she felt guilty for ever doubting. The Fae might be under no obligation to rule, but there was no denying that they collectively cared for the people around them. When a flash flood had swept through the Low Country, washing away almost an entire village, a group of Fae had shown up the next morning with blankets and food. When bears were terrorizing a hamlet, or a vampire was spotted by a group of fishermen, a host of immortals would ride to their aid. They tended to the wounded, nursed the sick. They rebuilt roads and settled disputes that had turned violent between neighboring villages. They never received anything in return. They never stayed any longer than they had to, but never once had they turned their back on a creature in need. Even this market, Kiera thought, glancing around at the booths as they curved along the edge of the crowd. They have no need for this. They simply open their doors to provide a safe place for others to trade. You have never been here. Her head snapped up to see the Fae watching from the corner of his eye. He didn't phrase it as a question, but she felt compelled to answer all the same. I had never travelled beyond my village, she replied in a small voice. I could never have imagined something like this. I'm not even sure what to call it. Not a village, not a town. Some people call it a city, Jessie inserted, walking along beside her. A city, she repeated slowly, having never heard the word. It's not a city, it's a stronghold, the Fae corrected, sweeping ahead of them in those agile strides. He glanced about the market before adding under his breath, The city is yet to come. The pair shared a quick look, then hurried after him. Whatever it was called, the immortal settlement was even larger than it had looked from the gate. No sooner had they cleared one winding road than their guide would turn and lead them up another, pausing every now and then to greet an acquaintance or answer the call of a friend. It had just gotten to the point where Kiera was wondering how they were ever going to find their way back, when the street widened abruptly into another outdoor courtyard, a bit smaller than the first. It was here the Fae paused for a moment, scanning around before heading with a sudden purpose to a cluster of tables on the far side of the square. A small crowd had gathered around them, blocking the tables themselves from view, but, judging by the charged silences and sudden bursts of applause, Kiera was guessing they were spectating some kind of game. Don't say it had 3 heads, Jessie said abruptly, lowering his voice to avoid being heard. She glanced up at him in surprise. What? His eyes flickered around the courtyard before returning to hers. People are more likely to believe your story if you stick with a single head. She considered it with a bit of reluctance, not wanting to start their grand adventure on a lie, but after only a second's deliberation, she decided he was probably right. Fine. They quickened their pace as they crossed the length of the courtyard, catching up with their guide just as he came to a stop beside the tables. She'd been right. It was a group of people playing dice. As fate would have it, the players weren't primarily Fae, although some were watching, clearly amused. There seemed only a handful of immortals willing to mingle with the common folk. And there was one game in particular that had risen above the rest. Again? The players had been whittled down, and there were only 2 left at the table. One was a shifter, red-faced and furious, with a dwindling pile of coin and a goblet of ale that had been refilled one too many times. The man sitting across from him was clearly Fae, though he was facing the opposite direction, and Kiera couldn't get close enough for a better look. It isn't possible, the shifter cried in dismay, nearing the end of his rope. I don't care how many years you've been roaming this earth. No one's luck is that good. He pounded his fist on the table, rattling what little remained of his purse, but the Fae merely picked up the dice, twirling them almost absent-mindedly in the palm of his hand. Luck, he repeated with amusement. You still believe in luck? He toyed with the dice a moment longer, then released them with a flick of his fingers. A hush of silence fell over the crowd as they spiraled into the air, hovering for what seemed like a small eternity before falling to perfection in the middle of the table. Curse you! The goblet went flying, clattering on the polished stone. At this point, Kiera could understand the frustration. It's like the Fae was charmed. No matter how many times he rolled the dice, they came up in his favor. And he'd rolled them quite a few. "I'd be willing to talk terms whenever you wish to surrender," he continued, stretching his long legs under the table. The dice rattled like a playful warning in his hand. "Unless this is meant to be a lesson in humility for your friends." There was another breathless silence, another roar from the crowd. Money was quickly changing hands, and the stakes had risen to the point of sharpening the initial excitement. The shifters were getting more and more frustrated. The Fae were chuckling. Then the man at the table gave the dice a final throw. "Unbelievable." "Enough!" The table overturned as the shifter leapt to his feet, drawing a mighty sword from his belt at the same time. It sliced through the air with a metallic hiss, spinning twice before going level with the Fae's neck. The crowd gasped and melted backwards as the Fae stared calmly up from his chair. "You cheated!" the shifter roared, tightening his grip. "I'll have your head!" A silver arrow appeared between them. Kiera blinked in astonishment. She hadn't seen the Fae move, yet there he was, standing in front of the shifter with a bow lifted to his shoulders. 2 fingers pulled back the string as the point grazed the man's flushed skin, tracing an invisible line up the center of his face. "That's a serious accusation," the Fae murmured thoughtfully, "and a serious request. My head." He paused for a moment, pretending to consider. "What do you think I could get for it?" There was a tittering of laughter from the crowd. Even the shifter's pack found themselves joining in, even as their companion surrendered his blade to the ground. "Perhaps you could give me your hat," the Fae continued, lifting it slightly with the tip of his arrow. "Though I suppose I'd hardly have a use for it." His eyes danced with amusement. "The irony just kills me." At that point, the crowd began laughing in earnest. The shifter himself couldn't resist a begrudging grin, but the Fae who'd escorted them had apparently grown tired of the little game. He called softly as the others began to disperse. "Eden." The Fae turned ever so slightly, then sheathed his bow and picked up the bag of coins on the table. He weighed it a moment, then tossed it back into the shifter's hands. "Perhaps you'll have better luck next time." The man was still gaping in astonishment when the Fae downed the rest of his ale and turned from the table, slipping the dice into his pocket as he stepped into the light. Kiera froze perfectly still. In the last few days, her world had expanded beyond what she could have ever dreamed. It painted each moment in a surreal kind of wonder, requiring no level of understanding, but merely that idea that she began taking things on faith. It was a lesson that was seeping into her very bones. But nothing could have prepared her for that moment when she saw him for the first time. It was as if every line of him had been imagined, created by some thoughtful dreamer, then magically breathed into life. Unlike his cool counterpart, there was a warmth to him, a lightness that seemed to transcend above all the rest. It shone out of him like a beacon, illuminating every feature, until the sight of him standing on a common street was suddenly absurd. He would have been more believable riding a stallion across the heavens, smiting monsters and demons with a swing of his flaming sword. He would have belonged more clearly in a book or a painting, an immortal muse to inspire the lesser creatures still toiling away on the mortal plains. Eden. The name suited him. "Darius," he said cheerfully, making his way towards them through what remained of the crowd. "You're looking especially dashing this morning. Is that a new cloak?" The Fae who'd brought them cracked a smile. "I have a present for you." He nudged the pair forward. "It appears these two have gotten into some trouble with a dragon." Eden regarded them without a hint of expression. Now that he was closer, it was easy to pick up on everything else Kiera had been missing. all those details she'd been too distracted to notice before. He had the hands of an archer, though that was hardly distinguished. Every Fae was an archer, though she got the feeling this one was better than most. His hair was ash brown and shimmered when it caught the sun, falling past his shoulders like the rest of his kind. He was tall and lean, touched with the celestial grace of his people, with a face so exquisitely lovely one could not help but stare shamelessly. But it was his eyes that drew Kiera's attention. They were like sea glass, at times the clearest blue, at times sneaking hints of green, a hypnotic shade all his own. He hadn't been fazed by the mention of a dragon, but that might simply have been because he didn't believe it. Beasts of the ground were common enough, but those that flew in the sky... After a few seconds, he looked back to Darius. "You said you weren't angry. I'm not angry. Then what's this? I told you it's a present." He opened his mouth to say something further, but Darius added something in their native tongue and left with a parting smile. Eden stared after him with a wry expression before turning his gaze to the others. A touch of impatience strained his features, but he remained unfailingly polite. "A dragon, that's a serious problem." He let out a breath. "Why don't you tell me where you saw this dragon, and I'll see what I can do." Kiera stared back in astonishment, feeling as though someone had poured ice water down her spine. This was how it happened? The same way a parent appeased an exasperating child before urging them outside. She had been left without a future, sustained only by the hope of retribution. The Fae was playing with his dice. "Let's go," Jessie muttered. "This is a waste of time." She took a step backwards, then pulled her sleeve free of his grasp. "The creature incinerated my village. A community of people vanished in the blink of an eye. It takes longer to tell the story than to have seen what actually happened, but I can see more pressing matters require your attention. I'm sorry to have wasted some of your endless time." Eden looked at her in surprise, then slipped the dice back into his pocket. "What is the name of your village?" "Cataling." This produced slightly more of an effect. It may have been a remote location, but news travelled fast, and even the Fae had heard rumour of the tiny settlement that had burned to the ground. The various people who told the story had attributed such a thing to wildfire. It was tragic, but such things had happened before. His eyes softened, looking her up and down. "You were there?" he asked gently. "Were you injured?" "I was in the forest gathering water," she began, then suddenly understood the reason for his question. A traumatized girl sees a catastrophe, strikes her head, and invents a wild story to explain it. A fearsome dragon raining terror from the sky. Certainly more deserving than to have lost her home to a common fire. Perhaps she even believed the story herself. "I was not injured." She held his gaze without blinking, praying that Jessie wouldn't give her away. The days he'd spent nursing her back to health in the cave would beg to differ, but the shifter held his tongue. "I will look into it," Eden said again, a bit softer this time. "You have my word. In the meantime, there is plenty here to replenish anything you've lost. You need only ask." "It had 3 heads," Jessie interrupted. Kiera sucked in a breath, casting a panicked glance between them. But for the first time since hearing this story, a flash of genuine curiosity sparked in the Fae's eyes. It was not the first time he'd heard tell of such creatures. There had been whispers of their kind before. Most all of these had been dismissed outright as the ravings of hysterical townsfolk, but the question remained. His eyes drifted towards the horizon, before twinkling with a smile. "In that case, there's no time to waste." "You must be joking." One of the Fae who'd been watching the game and casually eavesdropping on their conversation called out in surprise. "You're actually going with them?" "You heard the girl." Eden gave her a wink. "There's a dragon afoot." She warmed with a smile as the other Fae chuckled and shook his head. You would really go so far just to avoid... No time to chat. Must be off. Eden tossed the dice into the air, then started heading back across the courtyard, motioning for them to follow with a wave of his hand. Jessie caught them, then passed them over to Kiera. They were perfectly normal, not weighted or rigged at all. Maybe he really is that lucky. She turned them in her fingers, looking with a little smile. We're going to need all the luck we can get. Chapter 11. When Eden said there wasn't time to waste, he'd apparently done so for theatric effect, because he led them not towards the main gate, but to the local inn just within sight. I appreciate the urgency of the situation, he explained when they stopped questioningly in front of the door, but the sun is setting, and it looks as though you might want a night to rest. It was a delicate way of phrasing all those insecurities that Kiera had been plagued with before. The dirt-smeared faces, the bruises from sleeplessness, the inexplicable absence of certain clothes. She blushed as he turned to the proprietor, then stretched up to whisper in Jessie's ear. Do we have enough coin for this? It didn't seem possible the Fae could have heard, but he turned almost immediately. The charge has been settled. The manager owes me a favor. He is searching now for any available rooms. He watched as Jessie discreetly scanned the crowd, keeping his face angled away from the street. Perhaps something near the stairs? He led them shortly after, promising to return at first light. Kiera watched as he strode into the twilight, wondering at a man who would risk so much based upon so little, wondering at a man who could upend his immediate future with only a few hours to prepare. It wasn't until he'd all but vanished that she realized he'd never asked for their names. Shall we? She glanced back to see Jessie waiting beside an impatient-looking man at the base of the stairs. A key dangled from one hand, and a pitcher of water was balanced in the other. She cast a final look at the courtyard, then joined them. We shall. Do you know what's strange? This almost feels like home. Kiera stretched back on a generously cushioned bed, wriggling her toes in the fleece linen as the pillows curved luxuriously beneath her neck. There had been a bit of awkwardness when the door had swung shut behind the manager, leaving her and Jessie alone in a quiet room with nothing except a bed. But they had pushed past it rather quickly upon discovering the room was pleasantly heated and including an adjacent tub. After only a few minutes to revel in such decadence, she had decided to forget the idea of dragons altogether and simply live out the rest of her days in bed. You had this kind of thing back home? Jessie asked in surprise, appearing in the doorway. He'd wrapped a towel around his waist and was holding another in his hand, patting at the dark strands of hair dripping down the sides of his neck. The bath had been a rather transcendent experience. He'd made a similar vow in those steaming waters to stay there forever and never return. She shook her head blindly, snugly encased within her cocoon. Not anything so extravagant, but I used to live above the tavern. She paused a moment, listening to the lively chorus drifting up the stairs. It was interspersed every so often with the clink of glasses. At home, it would have been interspersed with the sound of fighting as well. You hear that? That was my lullaby. Since I was 10 years old, I've never fallen asleep to anything different. He considered this a moment, watching from the corner of the room. The forest must have been very quiet. Different kind of lullaby. She propped up onto her elbows, seeing him for the first time. But yes, it was very quiet. Her eyes swept over him, lingering on the spirals of steam rising from his skin. What about you? Have you ever stayed somewhere like this before? He shook his head, picking up his clothes and dropping them into the bath. They stayed there a moment, blending with the soap. Then he lifted them out and draped them over the side. Never, he replied shortly. If the pack ever travelled, we would sleep in the woods. He threw a quick glance around the room, tensing with the hint of a frown. A part of me can't believe we're staying here now. The Fae are very, very free with their money. It's kind, but unsettling. She nodded again, curling her knees to her chest. It was a lesson that had been drilled into every child born in a leaderless land, to be wary of acts of charity, to avoid incurring a debt that one could never hope to repay. Speaking of debts that can't be paid, what do you think of him? She asked curiously. His eyes flew to the bed. What do you think of him? He countered just as fast, studying her from well behind a veil of tangled hair. I thought you were going to take a swing at him when he tried to blow us off. She smiled faintly before growing thoughtful. I think the three of us found each other for a reason. Her cheeks burned, and she cast a nervous look at his face. Is that a ridiculous thing to say? He stared at her a moment, then shook his head with a tender smile. No, it's not. The room grew abruptly quiet as they averted their eyes. Since the two of them had collided together only a few days before, there hadn't been time to process anything that happened. Each day had been a series of unending challenges, triumphs and fears, ground both gained and lost. From their fateful meeting on the road, to their subsequent near drowning in the river, down to the secret revelations that had tied the two of them together, binding them fast and strong. But the ground was always shifting. Tomorrow would be something new. And what about that kiss? She flashed him a secret look. That almost kiss. Whether or not he was wondering the same, it was impossible to tell. It was a strange enough thing to have happened, let alone in the back of a drunkard's wagon. Why did you tell him about the dragon? She asked suddenly. You told me specifically not to say anything about it having 3 heads. Then you told him yourself. He raked his hair back with a grin, knotting it behind his head. The man gambles but has no interest in money. He pushes limits until he finds himself on the wrong side of a blade. He likes taking chances, he concluded, remembering the skirmish by the tables, the adventure in the Fae's eyes. I thought it might be the best way to get him on our side. She stared a moment, then nodded. Yes, I think you're probably right. Without another word, the two of them split off to prepare for bed. She washed as best she could, considering she would be getting right back into a weathered cloak, then combed her fingers through her long locks, trying to remove the tangles. At the same time, he wrung out the water that remained in his clothes and hung the shirt outside to dry. By the time he closed the window, she was already back under the covers. I wanted to thank you for giving me the bed. He glanced over in surprise, then let out a bark of laughter. Oh, did that happen? I must have forgotten. Must have. He chuckled again, settling down on the floor. You may have the bed. I would never dream of taking it from you. The smile froze on her face as she grabbed for his arm. Don't be silly, I was only teasing. We've slept by each other every night in the forest. Why would it be any different when we have the chance to sleep in a bed? I don't know, but it is. The second she said the words, she regretted them. In fact, she regretted calling attention to the issue one way or another. Even more so because he seemed to be thinking the exact same thing. After a few seconds of silence, he tilted his head to catch her eye. It's really all right, I don't mind the floor. Her cheeks flamed, and she vowed to drown herself in the tub the moment he was sleeping. Of course it's all right. Here, you can have this side. Without another word, he climbed onto the mattress, and the two of them nestled under the covers, shifting around as they tried to get situated. Sure enough, it felt a great deal more awkward than when they'd been sleeping beneath the stars. But the bed itself was so comfortable that it made little difference. Only a few moments later, they were settled, warm, reveling in the fleeting comfort as their aching bodies relaxed with a long-awaited sigh. I had imagined that many people would come with us, she admitted, not just a single man. She flashed him a sideways glance. What do you suppose he intends to do? Jesse stared at the ceiling, arms folded behind his head. I'd guess he's planning to travel back to Catling and see the damage for himself. A single Fae is coming with us because the word of a single Fae is enough to convince the rest. She twisted around to face him, staring with wide eyes. And what then? Well, if he thinks it was a dragon, I'd imagine he'll return to Arthurian and tell the others what he's seen. Then the Fae will set out with a larger force and hunt the creature together. She nodded along, imagining it at the same time. And how would they do that? I don't know. I'm not an expert in dragons. There was a pause. Do you think they have an expert in dragons? The bed shook with silent laughter. I think that we should probably get some rest. He flashed her a teasing smile, eyes painted silver in the moonlight. Not that I don't enjoy your late-night interrogations. She shoved him with a grin. I'm not interrogating you. There's a time to speak and a time to be still. She hitched onto her elbows. You're on my hair. I'm not. Just stop fidgeting. You are, she insisted, trying to squirm free. You make all these grand speeches about... crap. With a little yelp, she lost her balance and toppled straight off the side of the bed, legs tumbling over the frame. Her eyes snapped shut as she braced for impact, but a second before she could land, a pair of steady hands caught her by the wrist, lifting her gently back onto the bed. She lay there a moment, trying to catch her breath. Then she said the last thing in the world she'd been planning to say. You keep saving me. The joke he'd been preparing died on his tongue as he stared at her in surprise. It had been said quietly, more of a thoughtful observation that she was making to herself, but the second she felt his gaze, she stared up at him in the darkness, those blue eyes locked intently upon his face. On the road, in the river, she shook her head slowly, all the nerves melting away. No matter what happens or however dreadful things get, you keep saving me. He caught his breath, staring down at her. Bad habit. She smiled and he blushed. Then his hand slipped into her hair. A second later, their lips found each other in the darkness, hesitant at first, then easing open, melding themselves together as the last of the day faded slowly into night. Whether it was the beginning of an adventure, or the taste of the shifter still on her lips, Kiera had trouble falling asleep that night. She tossed back and forth, staring at the ceiling and counting the tiles on the floor, before eventually getting up and padding to the window. The hour may have been late, but the people of Arthurian had little interest in sleep. The doors of the taverns were thrown open, the streets were still streaming with people, and tiny lanterns had been strung amongst the flowering trees, glittering like fireflies upon the silver branches. She rested her chin on her hand and stared down at them, breathing an unexpected sigh of contentment as they passed on parade through the frosty night. The darkness was such that their faces blended into one another, illuminated only when they passed beneath the glowing branches of the trees. But no matter how dense the shadows, there were always points of light. By the gods! She watched as a pair of women headed out of an apothecary and made their way down the street, unable to remember a time she had ever seen anything so lovely. As unspeakably beautiful as the men of the Fae had proven to be, they were surpassed tenfold by their female counterparts. These women were pure enchantment, more angel than anything else. With the stars in their eyes and a rosy bloom on their cheeks, their silken gowns whispered across the stone. She found herself wanting to know them, wanting to be near them, wanting to pour out her secrets and find solace in the squeeze of a soft hand. She found herself wishing very much she had a dress of her own. Would I never have seen something like this? Would I always have stayed in my village? It seemed a foregone conclusion. Those who had been born in a certain part of the world seldom had reason to leave, and yet the stronghold itself had been constructed as nothing more than a convenience of location. The people who lived there were all from someplace else. She stepped away from the window, preparing to get back into bed, when a lone figure caught her eye. How she recognized him from such a distance, she would never know, yet she was absolutely certain it was Eden, leaning against a shuttered storefront, staring up at the stars. The man was about to embark upon what she'd consider an epic journey, but for whatever reason, she didn't think that was what was on his mind. There was a lit window on the other side of the courtyard where his eyes kept drifting. After a few drawn-out minutes, he eventually headed inside. She eased away from the window, trying to slow her racing heartbeat as she climbed back into bed. It did no good to keep ruminating. The best thing she could do was rest before morning. There was no telling what tomorrow might bring. When Kiera woke the next morning, Jessie was still sleeping beside her. She took the opportunity to stare for an unguarded moment, struck again by the youthful beauty of his face. Surrounded by a stronghold of immortals, there seemed something more real about him, more grounded, a sort of tangibility that made her want to reach out and touch him with her hand. Am I allowed to do that now, after what happened last night? An involuntary shiver swept across her skin as she decided to merely look instead, her eyes drifting across the length of him, coming to rest on his lips. Good morning. She jumped in her skin, only to find him staring right back at her, a faint smile playing around the corners of his mouth, quite possibly wondering what she was doing so close. I'm sorry, she replied, tucking her hair behind her ear. I was just... Don't apologize, he interrupted easily. You did nothing wrong. He hesitated a moment, then leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek. A rush of heat passed between them, and he leaned back just as fast, uncertain as to their new footing, wondering just how far over the line they had strayed. I wish I knew. She flashed a shy smile, avoiding his gaze. Were you able to sleep? He stretched out his arms, keeping the sheets at his waist as he scanned around for his clothes. More than you. I was worried you were going to jump out that window. She laughed in spite of herself, feeling the colour rise to her cheeks. Just to keep things interesting. Just to make sure each day keeps topping the last. He smiled as well, keeping his eyes on the blanket. I am pretty sure we accomplished that, aren't you? Silence. It was one of those terrible moments that could have turned into something extraordinary, but ended up making all the people involved wish they were either comatose or dead. The room itself seemed to drop in temperature, sending a prickling chill over their skin, while each became abruptly aware that the rest of the settlement was still sleeping, and it was very, very quiet. We should probably... let's get downstairs. They dressed quickly, taking great care to avoid looking at each other, then headed down to the tavern as fast as decorum would allow. While the place had been teeming with customers the night before, not a single person was left in the room. The tables had been wiped down, the floor had been swept, and all that remained of the previous festivities was a lonely bowl of fruit on the counter. They glanced towards the kitchen, glanced toward each other, then both took an apple. Then Jessie panicked at the last second and set down a coin. There's no need for that. A tall man swept into the room, one who was most definitely something a bit more than human. His face was a vision, and his hair was strung with tiny braids, pulled halfway back to show the tips of his pointed ears. Not the manager they'd met the night before, but the owner perhaps. You are both friends of Eden's, and are staying here as my guests. It took a second for Kiera to place the name. Another second to wonder why it was that so many people in the settlement seemed to know who he was. He probably sustains the entire stronghold with his gambling habit. Thank you, she said respectfully, wanting so very much to reach up and touch the tips of his ears. That's incredibly kind. He nodded dismissively and gestured them toward a table, sweeping back down the hall to make preparations for the day. They waited until he was gone, then sat down at a different table beside the window, watching as the sun rose over the hills and the settlement came slowly back to life. We've been trying for so long to get here, Kiera murmured, tightening the cloak with a shiver. I can't believe we're already leaving. I wish that we had more time. He cast a quick look across the table, his brow tightening with concern. We need to find you some clothes before we leave. He glanced around the storefronts, slipping the coin he'd attempted to pay with back into his pocket. And some shoes, and possibly a blade. I'd say we should go right now, but I'm not sure when the Fae will be meeting us. Or if we'll have enough money to buy everything we need. She nodded absent-mindedly, staring at the blossoms on the trees. I'd like to have seen the library. We should have asked him to meet us there. That I have seen, Jessie said suddenly, eyes warming at the thought. They were just starting to build one in Harrenthal, this great spiral that's supposed to stretch into the sky. The Fae swept back into the room, his hands full of parchment. Harrenthal, he repeated with a touch of scorn. A small trading town, nothing more than a collection of flasks and tents. But yes, they're building a library. Jessie tilted his head with a caustic smile. And your people can do better. The Fae's bright eyes drifted towards the window, missing the sarcasm, but engaged by the question nonetheless. Can we do better? In a flash, they saw a glimpse of the same excitement they'd seen stirring in other parts of the stronghold, a feeling of anticipation just waiting to burst into life. My people have their sights on more than a single library, he replied softly, staring past the rooftops and into the sky. We're going to build the biggest city the world has ever seen, a shining beacon at the heart of civilization, bringing light to our people for countless centuries to come. Jessie took a bite of his apple. What's it to be called? The Fae glanced at him with a hint of annoyance. That hasn't been decided yet. All that matters? Good morning. The door swung open and Eden burst inside, looking like the spirit of adventure come to life. There was a flush in his cheeks and sword at his side, with several long knives hidden in various places on his person. A weathered travelling cloak swept the ground behind him, and the twisted braids of his hair fell lightly alongside the bow and quiver strapped to his back. He took a single look at the mismatched trio and tilted his head with a smile. Well, this looks uninviting. His eyes twinkled as they swept between them, coming to rest on his friend. Whatever are the three of you talking about? The Fae muttered something that was met with a laugh, before switching to the common tongue. I was telling your young companions about Taviel, not that the boy was very receptive. Jessie dropped his eyes with a flush, but Eden merely smiled. Perhaps we should build the city before we settle on a name. At any rate, I need to steal these two. We're very busy this morning, lots to plan. The Fae pushed to his feet. Ah, yes, he said with a wry grin. You're off to find a dragon. Tales will be sung of our glory, Eden replied with a wave of his hand. I'll see you in the hereafter. Or not, depending on how it goes. The Fae chuckled under his breath and headed outside, while Jessie and Kiera shared a quick look. It was unsettling enough embarking upon a journey with a complete stranger, and despite his open demeanour, their new companion was completely impossible to read. Good morning, he said again once they were alone. I've gotten some supplies." With that, he doubled back to the door and returned with 2 giant satchels, which he proceeded to set upon the nearest table. "Forgive the presumption, but it looked like you hadn't brought much." The pair shared another look, then ventured forward, lifting the clasps and rifling around inside. Tentative prodding soon turned to open wonder as they set the items one by one upon the table, finding absolutely everything they'd need for a journey stashed safely inside. "I didn't bring a tent," Eden said offhandedly, stealing an apple. "We might regret that later, but there is a weight to such things, and we might do better to travel light." Jessie nodded with instant agreement, looking a bit overwhelmed, while Kiera was unable to tear her eyes away from the table, truly astonished by everything he'd managed to find. There were canteens and rolls of bandages, a hatchet and flint, such a random assortment of cooking paraphernalia she was suddenly convinced the man hadn't the faintest idea how to prepare food, along with a few jars of herbal tinctures, the likes of which she had never seen. It was all the basics they'd been missing, all those things she and Jessie had so painfully gone without. But there were other items as well, ones that tugged right at the core of her. "What on earth?" She froze in astonishment, then lifted an ivory shirt from the bottom of the bag. It was the kind of thing she'd seen men wearing about the tavern, but this was made from a finer material and had a distinctly feminine feel. Below it was a pair of leather pants, as well as a fitted jacket that had been treated with oil to keep out the rain. She ran a finger along the hem, unable to breathe. Never in her life had she received new clothing. Never had she seen anything so fine. "Is this for me?" Eden glanced over to check, then softened with the trace of a smile. "Not to be inappropriate, but I was left with the vague impression that you might have lost your dress at some point along the journey. It's cold at night, for nothing but a cloak." He looked around suddenly, rifling in his own pack. "Which reminds me, this is for you." He pulled out another cloak and tossed it to Jessie. "In case it rains." The shifter caught it with a quick hand, his face stilling in surprise. It had been shocking enough to see the wealth of supplies the Fae had brought with him, although all of those could be rationalized as being used for the collective good. A personal item for himself. That was something quite different. "I can't take this," he murmured, unable to meet the Fae's eyes. "I appreciate the gesture, truly, but you've already been more than generous. The packs themselves are more than enough." Eden stared back at him, trying to keep things light. "Come now, shifter. It would do terrible things for my reputation if I allowed one of you to freeze. I cannot take it." The Fae stared a moment longer, then reached across the table. "It occurs to me we haven't been properly introduced." The shifter froze in surprise, before shaking his hand. "I'm Jessie," he answered softly. "That's Kiera." Eden nodded slowly, then tightened his grip with a little smile. "Jessie, take the damn cloak." There was a second where nobody moved. A second where Kiera suddenly wondered if the Fae intended to simply hold him prisoner until he complied. Then Jessie slipped it over his arms. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Without another word, the trio began dividing up the supplies, rearranging things according to weight, so that no single pack was too great a burden for the person carrying it. What that basically implied was that Kiera was carrying most everything fabric, while the men were loaded down with all the rest. Under most circumstances, she would have protested merely on principle, but when the pack was set on her shoulders, she took an experimental step and decided to hold her tongue. When at last they were ready, Eden nodded to himself, then gestured for them to sit. "The way I see it, the plan is rather simple. The 3 of us will journey back to Catling so I can see the remains of the village for myself. If I'm satisfied with your explanation, we will return to Farian and my people will take further steps. Is this acceptable?" Kiera nodded quickly, perched on the edge of her seat. It was almost verbatim what Jessie had guessed he was going to do. Moreover, she was oddly pleased that he was addressing the skepticism so openly, rather than appeasing her with a lie. "Yes, that's acceptable." The Fae's eyes twinkled as they swept over her, lingering on the stray wisps of hair and nervous legs bouncing underneath the table. For a moment, it looked as though he might suggest she return upstairs for a quick nap to calm down, but he merely pushed to his feet. "In that case, we should be on our way." The apples were eaten and the canteens were filled. Jessie armed himself with an assortment of blades, while Kiera slipped away to change into her new clothes, staring in wonder at the mirror. A complete stranger stared back. One who looked more capable and resilient than she'd felt a day in her life. One who looked like all those travellers she'd always admired, trapped on the wrong side of the bar. She turned back and forth, biting her lip with a secret smile. Then she headed downstairs. The men were already packed and waiting, speaking softly as they stood by the door. Both glanced up when she entered, warming with an approving smile. Then Eden took a step forward. "Are you ready?" She nodded quickly, trying to hide her excitement. "I can't believe this is happening." "One last thing, I almost forgot." The Fae reached into the bottom of his pack and pulled out a pair of doeskin boots. "First step of every adventure. Put on your shoes." Chapter 12. This was a mistake. The three companions stood beneath the branches of an ancient pine, shivering under the thin cover as they stared in silence at the raging storm tearing across the land. Claps of thunder shook the ground as dazzling spiderwebs of lightning splintered across the sky. The ceaseless torrents of rain had been quick to follow, pouring upon their heads like the emptying of a river, while the gusts of screaming wind stabbed that damp chill right into their bones. Eden stared with a remote expression. "I'm so glad I decided to come." In spite of the fact that she was technically freezing, Kiera couldn't help but release a shivering gasp of laughter, bouncing slightly in place to combat the merciless cold. Since they'd set out upon the journey, their immortal guide had been full of such comments. At first, she'd believed it to be a serious problem, that the adrenaline was wearing off, the boredom was setting in, and he was suddenly regretting the fact that he'd set out to play dice in the first place, and had been conscripted to come along. Not until later did she realize each word was chosen and delivered with the utmost care, timing out to such caustic perfection it was guaranteed to make his despairing companions smile. Some of them. Jessie was staunchly refusing. "Did you not see fit to bring some kind of cover in those giant bags of yours?" he answered testily, hair dripping down his face. "Or perhaps a gag to silence all these inspiring thoughts?" Eden kept his eyes on the storm. "Perhaps I should have packed a canoe. Then we could have simply paddled to Catling." A trace of humour sparked in the shifter's eyes, but he didn't allow himself to smile. Instead, he merely regarded the clouds with a quiet sigh before turning to the trees. "At this rate we should set up camp." He hitched the bag higher onto his shoulder, squinting through the sheets of water into the distant trees. "There looks to be a bit more cover higher up in the hill. If we can find some kind of—" "No, this will clear up in a bit," the Fae interrupted calmly. "We can wait it out. Get a little bit farther along by nightfall." Kiera glanced between them nervously as every hint of humour faded from Jessie's eyes. "You think this is going to clear up?" he repeated sarcastically, gesturing to the violent squall tearing apart the land. "And you also assume that you'll be leading this expedition?" Eden glanced up with a hint of genuine surprise. "Of course," he replied simply. "You came to me for help." "So help then," Jessie fired back. "That doesn't put you in charge." The Fae turned ever so slightly to face him, trying to decide the strength of whatever words he used next. Then his eyes swept between the pair of them, before dancing with a secret smile. "Oh, I understand. We're playing hero, aren't we?" He watched as they blushed to high heaven, before turning with a quiet chuckle back to the storm. "Well, rest assured, dog, your little sweetheart isn't my type. We can wait out the rain without damaging your chances." Jessie let out a violent curse, but Kiera grabbed him by the arm. "Would it be so terrible to allow him to lead?" she asked under her breath, angling her body to block the Fae from the conversation. "Seeing as he's probably several thousand years old, he's clearly a bit unhinged, and we're both almost lost our lives travelling to seek out his expertise." The shifter hissed between clenched teeth. "He is intolerable. He has a kingdom of people who will ride to his aid," she interrupted. "Can you say that?" Eden was smirking behind them, hearing the entire conversation just as well as if she'd whispered it into his own ear. But when she turned around, he was innocent as a lamb. "We've decided to let you lead this expedition." "How generous," he declared with a smile. A second later, he glanced over his shoulder to where there was a sudden break in the churning clouds. "Ah, look, the rain stopped." In a moment that would forever leave the others baffled, a sudden gale of wind swept down from the distant mountains, shifting the course of the storm and blowing it slowly but surely out of their path. Already they could see bits of sun on the horizon, getting steadily brighter all the while. Eden took another look, then clapped the shifter cheerfully on the shoulder. "Shall we?" He headed down the hill without a backwards glance, assuming the others would follow along behind him. A trace of that smile danced in his eyes, and he whistled in time with his steps. "He did that on purpose," Jessie muttered, hesitating another moment out of sheer force of pride, before, begrudgingly, following out of the trees. Kiera glanced at the sky, then headed after him. Maybe he did. The tiny fellowship walked a few hours farther, until what remained of the sun had begun to vanish into the trees. At several points, Kiera was on the verge of simply stopping, not through any active rebellion, but merely because her body had become so tired she was buckling at the knees. But under no possible circumstance would she allow herself to slow down the others. It also helped a great deal that she was finally wearing shoes. "How do those fit?" Eden called, almost as if he was reading her mind. "I wasn't sure as to your size. If they give you problems, we can always stop and get you some others." Jessie flashed him a quick look, while Kiera shook her head in amazement. Considering the imperious and oftentimes cold reputation of the Fae, Eden was a bit of a paradox. He laughed easily, yet was quick to temper. He took great care in clearing a path for others, but was always the first to step through it himself. "They fit perfectly," she called back, stumbling in his wake. "Thank you." He stopped abruptly, turning in surprise. "You're tired," he observed, as if the thought had never occurred to him. "I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking of—" He trailed off, glancing around to the clearing. "This is as good a place as any to stop for the night. Shall we set up camp?" Before the others could respond, he was quick to add an innocent, "Jessie, would that be all right? I can make no decisions without you." The shifter flashed him a cold look, then threw down his pack. "I'll make a fire." "I'll do it," Kiera volunteered quickly, wanting to practice her new skills and be helpful wherever she could. "And don't worry about the dampness of the wood. It isn't a problem." For the next 15 minutes, she scurried around with secret excitement, gathering kindling, unaware that the others had finished their tasks in half the time and had merely settled against the trees to watch. Each new prospect was selected and examined with the greatest of care, turned over and over in her hands before being either abruptly discarded or added to the pile. It would not be just a fire, she had decided. It would be the greatest fire in the history of both fire and trees. When at last the pyre was ready, she knelt beside it with anticipation, holding her breath as she struck hard upon the flint. For a split second, it seemed as though her entire world hung in the balance. Then she lifted her head with a beaming smile as the flames sprang suddenly to life. "There, easy." If the world was a fair place, they would have teased her, but the thought never crossed their minds. Eden simply nodded with a quiet, "Well done," while Jessie gave her a secret wink. "Now that you've got that settled, I'll go hunt for something to eat." The shifter stood up gracefully, tying his hair back and lifting the trusty blade from the loop on his belt. Eden glanced up just as quickly, half rising to his feet. "I'm more than happy to do it myself." Jessie breezed right past as if he hadn't spoken, speaking loudly to Kiera, though she quickly began to suspect he was actually talking to someone else. "Be sure not to get lost while I'm away. It would spoil the whole night if I had to go out and find you. In fact, it would probably help a great deal if you sat by the fire and just shut up." The Fae made a supreme effort to hold back his laughter, while she flashed a sarcastic smile. "I'll see what I can do." She waited until he had vanished into the shadows, then waited a bit longer for him to pass from hearing. Then she turned to the immortal reclining beside the flames. "He's right. You're absolutely intolerable." The Fae merely smiled, his eyes on the trees. "He isn't used to other people taking care of him," he mused, staring after the shifter with a thoughtful expression. "I would imagine he's learned to get by entirely by himself." She followed his gaze, feeling the sudden need to speak on Jessie's behalf. "Perhaps he just doesn't like being told what to do." "Perhaps," the Fae murmured, staring into the forest. It was quiet for a moment, then his eyes twinkled with a smile. "Makes it even more rewarding to try." She laughed aloud, sneaking glances at him in the flickering light. It was the first time they'd been left alone, and she found herself abruptly nervous as to what she might say. What could one say to a starlit immortal? A man who'd been alive more decades than she could count in one breath. What could one say that he hadn't heard a dozen times himself? "Have you never seen a Fae before?" She startled back to attention, to see him watching her with a slight smile. If he was at all unnerved by the intensity of her staring, it didn't show. He merely stretched out beside the fire. "I cannot blame you," he continued with a hint of mischief. "You've spent your entire life in a small village. What could you possibly be expected to have seen?" Her heart rate spiked, as her cheeks flushed with a hint of colour. "I've seen gremlins," she said impressively, "and dwarves, and a few shifters." He nodded slowly, trying not to smile. "Impressive." "I've seen people," she snapped. "Is that not more important?" His face went still, then grew serious, regarding her in a whole new light. After a few seconds, he answered in a low voice. "I suppose it is." Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the flames. "And I'm not his sweetheart," she added suddenly. "What you said to Jessie before, when you were teasing him. I'm not his sweetheart. We've only just met." "And embraced, and kissed, and took off our clothes beneath the light of the moon." Eden nodded slowly, trying again to control his expression. "You have my apologies. It was a mistake." She stared at him shrewdly, biting the inside of her lip. "What did you mean before, that I'm not your type?" He glanced up in surprise, and she gestured to the fire. "I think you'll agree that I'm quite handy." He stared back in stunned silence, then threw back his head with a laugh. "It seems I have underestimated you." "Well, clearly not the fire," he interrupted, still chuckling. "You took the entire afternoon to build that fire. Your talent is with people. Breaking silences, keeping the peace. You read people. It is a gift." She warmed with a smile, feeling rather pleased. "I used to work in a tavern." He nodded thoughtfully, smiling to himself. That explains it. It was quiet for a few moments longer. Then he pushed to his feet, circling around the flames and resettling by her side. It caught her completely off guard, just like what he said next. You're mortal. Her eyes flew up in surprise. Excuse me? You asked why I said you weren't my type, he explained, flipping a lock of her hair with an affectionate smile. It's because you're mortal. She could not think of a single thing to say to this. She settled for a small, "Oh." His eyes twinkled in the light. You're also sweet. I wouldn't know what to do with that. The two of them shared another smile, then returned their gazes to the flames. While there was no telling when Jessie might return, a day's worth of travel in a storm had taken its toll, and they had plenty already with them to fill their time. There were blades that needed sharpening, clothes that needed mending, bows that needed to be tightened and restrung. They worked together in silence, occasionally passing things back and forth. Have you any family? She asked suddenly, watching the Fae's quick fingers sort through the arrows in his quiver, checking the binding on each one. Back in Arthurian. His head bent in concentration, eyes on his work. I am not from Arthurian, he repeated softly, but a place far away. Most people would have seen it as a clear dismissal. Kiera was most definitely one of those people, but she was also plagued with an incurable curiosity that made it impossible to turn away. But have you any family? He glanced up with a peculiar expression. I did not think you'd wish to speak of such things, he admitted, not while the pain of your own loss is so near. Her throat tightened with a pang of that same dizzying despair that had swept over her the first moment it happened, clouding her vision and stealing her sight. But she pushed it back, the same way she'd done every time it threatened to choke her over the last few days. I have no family, she said simply. Most of the people I grew up with did not. There was never much protection so deep within the forest. If one did not succumb to raids or accidents or illness, the elements themselves were formidable enough to take many a life. He grew very still, watching her. It was not an unhappy life, she added quickly, wanting to speak for all those who would never again be speaking for themselves. I was lucky for the man who owned the tavern to have taken me in. I had clothes on my back, a roof over my head. I have no right to complain. A heavy silence fell between them, and she nudged him with a coaxing grin. But I forget. You don't believe in luck. He smiled cheerlessly as they both thought back to the furious shifter who threatened to cut off his head over a simple game of chance. A bit of the darkness that followed her story lifted, but it did not fade entirely. There were traces of it still stirring in the Fae's eyes. The boy was right, he said quietly. I cheated. She glanced up in surprise, then shook her head. But the dice, she protested. I felt them for myself. There was no trick. After so many years, do you think I don't know how to throw a pair of dice? She stared at him incredulously, then burst out laughing. That isn't cheating, she insisted, remembering how he returned the shifter's money all the same. That's skill. That's just winning. His lips twitched as if he disagreed. When you play against someone whose skill is so inferior to your own, it amounts to the same thing. There is no victory in that, like taking sweets from a child. There was a note of sadness in his voice that surprised her, as if it wasn't the first time he'd considered such things. She stared a moment longer, then tilted her head to catch his eye. Have you done that as well? There was a beat of silence. Then they burst out laughing. They were still going strong when the shifter returned from the trees, a pair of dead rabbits slung over his shoulder. He cast them down in triumph, then regarded them warily, faced with an alliance he hadn't foreseen. By the time they quieted down and stood up to help him, the moment was forgotten. The tension lifted, and they resettled beside the roaring fire. It wasn't until much later that she realized he'd never answered her question. "This is heaven," Jesse murmured, stretching out beside the fire with a stick of roasted meat in his hand. Despite the luxurious tavern the night before, the only thing he and Kiera had managed to eat in the last 2 days was a single apple. "We can eat our fill, then salt the rest." She nodded happily beside him, taking a swig of water from her canteen. Despite the unseasonable chill, the woods were still teeming with game, and considering how sparse they'd found things on the journey over, a bit of surplus was a welcome relief. "What's the matter?" he continued suddenly, staring across the fire at Eden. The meat had long since cooled, but the Fae had yet to eat a single bite. "Is it not cooked enough?" "It's fine," Eden replied with a tight smile. "Thank you for preparing it." A casual deflection, but the shifter leaned forward, still on the hunt. "Then why aren't you eating it?" The Fae glanced quickly about the fire, searching for a plausible escape. However, left with literally no other alternative, he replied with a helpless, "I am." The others watched as he lifted the stick to his mouth and took a careful bite, closing his eyes with an involuntary grimace the instant the meat passed his lips. He chewed as little as possible before swallowing it down, looking as though he might be sick. "It's delicious." Jesse stared incredulously, but Kiera leaned forward with a sudden understanding. "You don't eat meat." It wasn't a question. The Fae would clearly have rather starved if the shifter hadn't made it a matter of pride. As it stood, he was avoiding their eyes, looking a great deal younger than before. "Is that true of every Fae?" she asked curiously. "Do none of you eat meat?" "Flesh," he corrected quietly, refusing to look the stick straight on. "You hide behind the word, but it is the flesh of animals. You might as well admit that we are eating a rabbit." Kiera graciously kept from laughing, while Jesse leaned forward with a grin. "Yes, I am eating rabbit, and we are wearing the skin of deer and cattle, and I'm sure over the course of your centuries you have slain countless men with the tip of your sword." His eyes sparkled with delight, thrilled to have been handed such easy ammunition. "I truly cannot believe you are so delicate about this." "It is not a matter of delicacy," the face snapped, hurling the stick towards him. "It is a matter of preference, and yes, if you must know, it was not cooked through." With that, he stormed away into the forest, presumably to retch up anything he'd been forced to swallow. The others stared after him before snorting with laughter into their hands. The entire day had been coloured so many shades of surreal, Kiera didn't know where to begin. From the 9 hours they'd hiked through a monsoon, to the panicked flail of vegetarianism, right down to the fact that she'd woken up naked in the shifter's bed. There were too many currents moving at once, too many forces at play. "Do you think he'll be all right?" Jesse shook his head, still chuckling. "No, I think there's something very much the matter with him." He recanted with a grin at the look on her face. "Yes, he'll be all right, though I highly doubt he'll forgive us." He tilted his head, staring into the dancing fire. "They're delicate creatures, aren't they? What's the phrase that people always use? Creatures of precarious temperament." Kiera shot him a sarcastic grin, remembering just a few hours earlier when that delicate creature single-handedly moved aside a tree that had fallen into their path. Delicate, sure. Just a few seconds later, the Fae re-emerged, staring at them stiffly as he wiped the sides of his mouth. "I have returned so you can apologize." Jesse placed a hand over his heart. "And I do apologize, quite deeply." "Come now, be kind," Kiera reasoned as they settled on opposite sides of the fire. "Or have you forgotten that our new friend is here only as a courtesy and deserves nothing but thanks?" Eden nodded sharply, but Jesse only smiled. "That's not how I remember it," he answered. "I seem to remember your friend at the stronghold phrasing it somewhat differently. as if this was the easier of two paths. The Fae tensed involuntarily as Kiera leaned forward with sudden eagerness. "That's right," she exclaimed, remembering as well. "What was it that he said? He was teasing you, I think, saying that you were coming with us just to avoid—"
"Oh, sweetheart,"
Eden interrupted lightly. "Didn't anyone teach you it's terrible manners to pry into someone else's affairs? What did those parents of yours die before that could happen?" "And you cut him off, just like that." It was his custom, she was quickly coming to realize. Those cheerful deflections. They were often done with a smile or a wink, but it was a clear boundary at the same time. She shouldn't have expected any different. With centuries of distance between them, Fae were known for being aloof. This one wasn't quite aloof, but they lived in two different worlds. "Perhaps Kiera's right," Jessie said with a sly grin, "and we've forgotten our manners." Eden flashed him a sharp look, but smiled in return. "And how do you think this dragon will feel?" he answered teasingly, tossing another log onto the fire. "When we burst in on its entire family?" "I think it will like its chances against a vegetarian." "You think there's more than one?" Kiera asked in surprise, forgetting the banter as they broached the subject for the first time. "Dragons usually travel alone." "And they usually have one head," Eden replied calmly, staring into the flames. "We must be prepared for anything." He stared a moment longer, then pushed abruptly to his feet. "On that note, you both should get some rest. I'll wake you in the morning." Kiera nodded and settled down amongst the blankets, while Jessie glanced across the fire. "You mean to keep watch until sunrise?" he asked in surprise. "Why don't you wake me after midnight? We can break it into turns."
"That's a kind offer," Eden interrupted smoothly, "but I prefer to do it myself. Get some rest, Shifter. We'll have a long hike in the morning."
He reached for his bow, but Jessie was already on his feet. The jokes may have subsided, but the sharpness beneath them remained. It simmered dangerously now, threatening to spill over. "You don't trust me?" The Fae threw back his head with a laugh. "What a hilarious idea," he chuckled, strapping the quiver to his back. "No, child, I don't trust you. I don't know you, and I have very little faith in the rest of your kind." Jessie stepped back, looking stunned.
"But the rabbit was delicious."
On that note, he walked away, singing a suspiciously familiar tune under his breath.
"I've got me a fishmonger's wife, I did say, the very fishmonger who sold me this bay."
Kiera and Jessie didn't see the Fae again that night, though they had no doubt that he was always nearby. Instead of merely sitting beside the fire, he'd chosen to walk in a slow perimeter, getting a little space from his new companions, scanning the trees and staring up at the sky. "Did you have a nice chat?" Jessie asked, flashing a sideways grin as they lay beside each other in the dark. "The two of you were thick as thieves by the time I got back." She took a second to remember, then smiled. "He is a bit of a mystery, charming but distant, kind but sad." She rolled onto her side, propping her head on her hand. "What if he doesn't believe me about the dragon?" Jessie rolled into the same position. "What do you mean?" "It's not like there's some belated proof he's going to find," she murmured with a hint of desperation. "It killed using nothing but fire, Jessie. What if he only sees the fire?" A sudden thought filled her with dread. "What if you only see the fire?" The Shifter stared at her a moment before turning onto his back. "If he only sees the fire, I'd imagine he'll go home, and that will be the end of it. Though if there's truly a dragon, as you say, Catling will not be the only village it claims. It will only be a matter of time before it's seen by a great many more people. Then we can start again." A shiver swept over her arms, and she raised her eyes to the heavens, tracing the shimmering constellations, wondering if there was any truth in those words, wondering if it was truly possible to start again. Chapter 13.
Kiera woke up the next morning feeling like she'd been dropped off a cliff. Every bone was chipped and battered, every muscle was aching from overuse. She brought her hands up over her face, praying for a quick death, then sat up with a groan as Eden swept into the clearing. "What in the world? How can I be this sore?" Despite having not slept a wink, the Fae looked fresh as the newly fallen snow, moving briskly about the campfire with a newly filled canteen and his bow and quiver still strapped to his back. If it weren't for the fact that they were technically on the same side, she might have decided to hate him. She croaked a pathetic greeting instead. "Good morning." He glanced over sharply, surprised to see her awake. "Is it?" he snapped. "Apparently not." She sat up gingerly, arms wrapped around her waist. The blankets were still warm, but Jessie was no longer sleeping beside her. The moment she noticed, he stepped into the clearing himself. "What's wrong with the Fae?" he asked bluntly. Eden ignored him, still rampaging quietly through the camp. "It is too long I have been at Arthurian," he muttered, "trapped behind those infernal walls, and I've committed perhaps the gravest folly one can imagine when embarking upon a quest." The others froze, staring in silence. "I've forgotten the whiskey." "Right." Kiera dropped back to the ground with a sigh, while Jessie folded his arms, watching with a secret smile as the Fae continued rummaging angrily through the bags. "I can't even imagine how it happened," he continued, patting down his cloak. "There are levels of priority to these sorts of things, and after all this time you'd think it was just—" Jessie extended a flask. "With my compliments." Eden froze with a look of true astonishment. "Where did you—" "There are levels of priority to these sorts of things," the shifter interrupted, unscrewing the top and offering it again. "You'll soon come to understand this." "He stole it from Fergus." The face stared a moment longer, then reached for it with a true smile. "I take back everything I've said about your kind." He took a lengthy drink, closing his eyes to savor the burn. "Wolves aren't completely useless. I have nothing but endless faith in you all." Jessie nodded thoughtfully, watching him drink. "Stereotypes can be misleading, but sometimes they're right on the mark." He gestured to the flask. "It's 9 a.m. That's a serious problem you've got." Kiera tensed involuntarily, but Eden flashed a genuine grin. "We've all got problems, Shifter. I'm rather delighted by mine." The two shared a laugh and set about preparing breakfast, smoking whatever remained of the rabbit over the smouldering coals. It was a slow process, but they managed to have a bit of fun with it, making jokes and telling improbable stories. But no sooner had they sat down to actually eat what they prepared than Eden threw a sudden glance across the fire, pushing to his feet. "What's the matter with your shoulder?" he demanded, circling round the dancing flames to examine it for himself. "Are you hurt?" Jessie stood up as well, keeping himself out of reach. "It's fine," he said quickly. "Just a little sore." Kiera looked up from the blankets, her mouth full of rabbit. "He pulled out the joint, dragging me from the river." Eden's eyes hardened as Jessie threw her a furious look. "What?" she whispered. "I think it speaks well of you." "And you didn't think to tell me this," Eden said sharply. "Given that we are traveling together and I rely upon your skills, why haven't you transformed? Does that not heal such things?" "You rely upon my skills?" Jessie quoted sarcastically. "This from the man who trusts no one but himself to keep watch. Don't try to guilt-trip me. I told you my shoulder is fine." The Fae merely smiled, pulling him closer. "Let's make sure." A brief examination was all it took. Just a quick scuffle, the unnecessary rip of a coat, and then the Fae's punishing glare when his eyes swept over the purplish bruising. "You see?" Jessie quipped, turning abruptly pale. "It's fine." Eden said nothing to contest it. He simply braced a hand against the shifter's chest and pulled the joint back into place. There was a violent snap, followed by a muffled gasp. Then he raised the flask. Cheers. Despite the rocky start to the morning, the rest of the day went a little easier. The weather was good, the skies were clear, and for the first time since the initial descent of winter, a warm breeze drifted down from the mountains, stirring the canopy of leaves. There was something inherently peaceful about it, a kind of tranquility that one could only find in the woods. Of course, that quiet serenity could never last long. Don't even know what to say about it. There are so many conflicting stories that it's impossible to know what's true, and that's when I could hear anything at all, which, if you've ever attended a bar in the Low Country, you'll know isn't the easiest thing to do. For the last several hours, Kiera had been prattling along happily, while the men on either side of her secretly plotted her death. If it weren't for the fact that they were trapped in the woods with nowhere to run, and she was clearly having the time of her life, they might have actually tried. To be honest, I'd usually get most of my information from Marcel. You remember Marcel, the shifter with the pet sheep that I told you about. Anyway, I'd usually get my stories second-hand from him, but then he laid down this rule saying that we could only discuss such things during certain hours of the day, because it was giving him anxiety, and after that I had to fend for myself. It was the kind of frenetic speech-making which didn't technically require an audience, and left very little room for error. Every so often, the shifter and the Fae would share a look behind her back. Every so often, one of them would reach for either a blade or an arrow. So, aside from some of the existential questions in terms of separating fact from fiction, there were few commonalities that most of the patrons seemed to have. She paused for breath, turning to Eden for the first time in miles. Here goes nothing. Can you read minds? He nodded thoughtfully, walking along beside her. Yes. Jessie raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Then there's the basic immortality. Naturally. Strength and valor? A given. You can change the weather. Always. Commune with the stars? Except on cloudy nights. They came to a pause, and she pulled in a bracing breath. And, of course, there are the ears. Silence. It was clear that was the moment she'd been waiting for, steeling herself with a lot of things she considered of lesser importance, like elemental powers and a strong aversion to death. There was a hitch in the Fae's stride, then he turned to face her. Would you like to touch them? There was a beat. Yes! She cried eagerly, reaching towards him. He stayed perfectly frozen, staring down with a dangerous expression. Would you really like to touch them? Think carefully, Kiera, before you reply. The hand dropped back to her side. So I don't know how much of that was actually true, or whether you're just a pathological liar, Jessie began thoughtfully. But communing with nature, you can do that, right? The Fae smiled to himself, continuing down the trail once more. The green places of this world are held together with a delicate balance. My people are in tune with this balance. To a limited extent, we hold a certain amount of sway. Modesty. This must be real. Yes, but there's more to it than that, Jessie pressed, studying him curiously. They say you can banish storms and hold back the tides. They say you can summon the power of beings not from this world, heavenly creatures. They say you can bring mortals back to life. A kind of shadow passed across Eden's face, like the ghost of a forgotten smile. They say a great many things, he concluded softly. Kiera stared up at him, utterly entranced. But are any of them true? She scrambled for an example, picking something she believed to be innocuous. Can you really pass messages to one another through the trees? He nodded abruptly, flicking her beneath the chin. You can as well, he said calmly, as long as you are within my presence. Why don't you give it a try, Kiera? Share the news of our quest with that elm." She took a reflexive step towards it, then glanced over her shoulder. "It might save the world," he said seriously. She stood there another moment, then threw a pine cone at his face. The three of them burst out laughing, slowing their pace as they climbed the slope of a hill, their boots slipping a little in the damp leaves. A pack was opened, and a canteen of water passed back and forth. When that was finished, the flask emerged as well. "You wish to hear stories about the Fae?" Eden asked, taking a swig and handing it back to Jessie. "I'll tell you a story, a warning about rivers and the creatures that live in them, since the two of you so recently decided to take a swim." "That's not quite how it happened." "There is a turn in the Ioxes River where the people who live in the nearby forests know it is never safe to go. The current is deadly, and the water is pure shadow, bringing nothing but sorrow and death. For many years, not a single person dared approach, except one day someone did." There was a hypnotic note in his voice and a musical cadence in his phrasing that drew one irresistibly closer, needing to know what happened next. No matter what else he might have said, the Fae were born storytellers. Even Jesse had slowed his stride, tilting his head to listen. "Normally, no creature would be so foolish, much less a Fae, but this one was tired and distracted, and from the looks of things, he'd just come from his lover. There he was, leaning over the water like a common horse, when a hand reached up from the deep." Kiera froze where she stood, staring in horror. "What was it?" He let her hang for a moment, before clapping his hands. "It was a kelpie," he declared, smiling as she jumped in her skin. "An entire herd of kelpies, rising from the water like ghostly spirits and pulling the Fae beneath the waves." She shook her head, fingers pressed over her mouth. "And what happened to him?" Eden glanced back in surprise, as if he'd already considered the story finished. "He fought them off bravely," he replied. "Ever the warrior, vastly outnumbered, though he managed to slay every single one. But the lesson remains." "If that was a true story," Jessie interrupted with a grin, "which I highly doubt, I guarantee the Fae died at the end of it." Eden gave him a hard stare, then turned to a sprig of holly. "Kill him." The companions walked until the sun went down and all the nocturnal creatures ventured from their secret homes to play. The usual sounds of the wood were replaced with their darker counterparts, the low whirling of a heron, the faint shuffling of a badger, the soft crunch of leaves beneath 100 padded footsteps, all of them framed within the rhythmic chorus of crickets. "I've never really been out in the forest at night," Kiera murmured, staring into the shadows as the breeze stirred her hair. "At least, never by intention. Whenever I was sent out for kindling or water, I'd hurry back and wouldn't linger. But this, it's beautiful at night. It's peaceful." Eden stood beside her, gazing into the trees. "It can be peaceful in the day as well," he said softly. "Unless your companion likes to talk." She gave him a playful shove, glancing down at his various blades. When they were dividing up supplies, it seemed a foregone conclusion that any weapons would be given to the men, seeing as she had no skill or experience using one. That hadn't bothered her at the time, but the sight of them fascinated her all the same. Eden saw her looking and picked one out. "Have you ever used one?" She shook her head, staring at the silver gleam. "Only for cutting fish." Why did I just say that? He glanced down at her curiously, then flashed a smile. "It's the same principle. You don't need to use much force. The blade is sharp enough. Any big wind-up only gives your opponent time to prepare. Little flicks of the wrist, that's the key." He demonstrated between them before passing it into her hand. "You try." She glanced up in surprise, then wrapped her fingers around the handle. taking a moment to find the right grip. When she was certain she wouldn't drop it and embarrass herself, she tried her best to imitate the motions he'd showed her before, slicing at imaginary demons in the air. He nodded to himself, watching appraisingly. Little flicks, just like that. That's very good, Kiera. I'm a natural, she replied, cheeks glowing in delight. Jessie, stop fiddling around and come over here. I want to cut your hair. The shifter glanced up from the fire he'd just finished building and pushed to his feet with a grin. Do you really think that's wise? He asked Eden, giving her the option to fight back. The Fae chuckled, still watching her progress. I think it's important for everyone to be able to defend themselves, especially a young woman travelling in the forest with two men who wish her harm. Little flicks. Little flicks. That's good, he murmured again, stepping forward to adjust her stance. Tomorrow we can work up towards bigger weapons. What we should really do is find you a bow. A ghostly howl cut through the night. Kiera froze where she stood while both men turned their heads in the same direction, their faces going suddenly still. For a moment, they hoped it would pass, that it was isolated and distant, nothing to trouble them further. Then another howl echoed in reply, and another, and another. These ones were much closer. Crap! Kiera shoved the knife back towards Eden, but he pressed it into her hand. Keep it, he breathed, eyes on the trees. You may need it. He stared for a moment longer before flashing a quick look at the shifter. Friends of yours? Jesse shook his head. No, they're just wolves. How can you possibly know that? They're hunting, he murmured, following their progress with a tilt of his head. There's easier game in this forest, Eden replied softly, doing the same thing. Wolves wouldn't attack 3 armed people standing beside a fire, unless they had an impossibly large... His face went still. Pack. Kiera was the last to see them, her eyes ill-equipped to pierce the darkness. She merely stood between the others, pale and shivering, until those glittering eyes appeared in the trees. Holy hell! It was worse than anything she could have imagined. Most packs tended to include between 10 or 15 wolves. Others could be as large as 30. While she didn't have the wherewithal or composure to count the ones approaching now, she'd have to guess there were upwards of 50. Eden's lips parted in astonishment as Jessie flashed him a quick look. You still don't believe in luck? Because ours is terrible. They poured out of the trees in what felt like slow motion, their shadowy bodies crouching low as they slipped through the dark. In a matter of seconds, the campsite was surrounded. That's when everything got frightfully quiet. Stay as close as you can to the fire, Eden said softly, reaching slowly behind him and pulling the bow from his pack. Don't let them separate you off into the woods. The others nodded, but had no idea how it made any sort of difference. There were simply too many of them. They didn't stand a prayer of making it out alive. Eden must have thought so too, because he cast a sideways glance at Jessie. I don't know your reasons, but it isn't the best time to stand on principle. For a split second, Kiera had no idea what he was talking about. Then the shifter nodded and began taking off his cloak. There was a shimmer in the air, a whisper of magic she'd never seen. Then the man vanished, and a ferocious wolf sprang up in his place. That's when all hell broke loose. There was a splintering growl, then the wolves surged forward, faster than Kiera could make sense of, with more ungodly power than she could possibly hope to withstand. She let out an involuntary shriek as the first one leapt towards her, but a hand grabbed the back of her cloak and yanked her out of the way. Instead of keeping her balance, she landed on the ground in front of the fire, staring up from the height of a child at a flurry of snarls and blades. It was like being trapped inside a nightmare. She wanted only to cover her eyes. As the flames burned at her back, The world before her was sliced with flashes of terror and ribbons of blood. No sooner would she try to stand than the ground would quake beneath her. No sooner would she suck in a breath than it would come flying right back out in a scream. With some vague part of her brain, she realized that she wasn't alone. Eden was fighting in front of her, flying around in a constant spiral of motion, a silver blade flashing in each hand. He'd quickly spent his quiver of arrows. They were planted like haunting flags in the bodies of the wolves lying in the distance, and he was battling them now in closer quarters, using his knives whenever possible, and his bare hands whenever it was not. In a way, he was almost harder to follow than the wolves. He was certainly faster. The only way she managed to keep track of him at all was by the occasional glint of his blades as they cut into the frame, reflecting the light of the moon. There seemed no end to him. He was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. At times he would merely defend, driving the wolves away from the circle of firelight. Other times he would initiate the attack himself, flying straight into the heart of them with a cry like the devil himself. There were yet other times when he would simply vanish into thin air, reappearing in a completely different location and leaving nothing behind him but a trail of bodies and blood. It was like watching something out of mythology, a fable playing out before her eyes. But still more kept coming, and there was only so long before some of them began to slip through. The first of these flew out of nowhere, leaping straight over the top of the flames and catching him unawares. Its teeth sank into the back of his shoulder, ripping and thrashing with all its might. He let out a painful cry before flipping backwards and landing just behind. He decapitated the beast with a swing of his sword, then kicked its broken body forward to destroy the momentum of 5 others. There was a series of snarls before they charged once again, coming from every side.
"Your knife, Kiera!"
he yelled, fending off 3 more with a single hand.
"Use your knife!"
For the first time since those massive shapes had emerged from the trees, she remembered the blade still clutched in her hand. She took a hesitant step forward, unsure where to start, when the decision was suddenly made for her as a wolf charged straight up from behind. She was still turning when it leapt onto her. She was still raising the knife. Little flicks, she thought, little flicks. But there was no time for any sort of strategy. The instant she felt its weight upon her, she began screaming and stabbing with all her might. The blade pierced the skin easier than she might have imagined, catching on the fur only on the way out. There were a couple of high-pitched yelps, a few fractions of a second where she thought there might be a bit of hope. Then a searing pain laced up her thigh. "Help me!" she cried out without thinking, falling onto her back as an enormous wolf advanced upon her, its teeth embedded deep in her skin. The knife flew from her hand, vanishing in the darkness, and she screamed again, kicking with her free leg and pounding her fists upon the top of its nose. "It's going to kill me," she thought in a mindless panic, "right here on the ground while everyone else is fighting for their own lives, and no one will even see." Her eyes streamed over as she groped blindly at the fire, scorching her fingers as she tried to dislodge a flaming log to swing at the creature. But just as the wolf released her leg and lunged for something better, the Fae appeared out of nowhere, wrapping his arms around its neck. "Eden!" She gasped his name without even thinking, watching as he tore the beast away from her and threw it like a nursery toy straight back in the center of its pack. Parts of him were bleeding. Parts of him were clearly broken. But with the fury of a young god, he charged into battle, fending off the beasts that remained with nothing but his bare hands. "Get up!" he commanded without looking, cracking the legs of one wolf while another sank its teeth into his arm. "Get up and fight!" She hastened to obey him, searching desperately for the fallen blade as she scrambled back to her feet. Only a few seconds had passed. All that in a few seconds. She hadn't even seen Jesse. In 1,000 years, she'd never understand how she knew it was him. In the dim light of the moon, the shadowy creatures flying around the clearing all looked the same. Yet her eyes rested upon one with absolute certainty. Her heartbeat quickened, and something inside her came back to life. In a controlled kind of frenzy, he flew in a circle around the clearing, tearing apart anything that stood in his path. Streams of blood poured from his jaws as those powerful muscles moved in perfect tandem, contracting together before springing forward, launching him into the night sky. There was a feral beauty in what he did. There was a savagery as well. As he stood there watching, he vaulted off the back of one wolf, merely to propel himself on top of another, dragging it helplessly to the ground with his teeth locked around its neck. She saw now there was a strategy to what they were doing after all. Eden had stayed close in front of her, fighting off anything that dared approach, while the shifter ran in that ceaseless circle, systematically decimating the perimeter. The wolves never saw them coming. Their eyes were locked on the people in front of the flames, not searching for trouble within their own ranks. That being said, they were catching on quickly. There was a sudden hitch in the circle, a sudden break in momentum, as two of the wolves racing towards the fire turned back suddenly and tackled him out of the air. Kiera's mouth opened in a silent scream as they tumbled violently across the ground, biting and snarling, scratching and growling. Then one of them pulled free from the others, dragging itself away in obvious pain. "Jessie!" She let out a scream, pointing wildly as Eden turned to look as well. While one of the wolves hadn't survived the attack, the other had recovered and was bearing down on him once again, ripping into every bit of flesh and leaving a trail of blood in its wake. It was as grisly as it was certain. Even from a distance, there was very little question as to how it would end. The Fae's eyes dilated in concentration before he threw the blade he was holding straight through the fire. It spiraled twice before burying itself in the back of the wolf's neck. There was a strangled cry, then it collapsed forward, pinning the breathless shifter underneath. It was a turning point, one that reverberated throughout the pack. At some unseen signal, the wolves that remained abandoned the struggle and raced back into the woods, calling out to one another as they vanished into the trees. Only a few seconds later, the clearing was empty and they were gone, leaving nothing but a sea of broken bodies in their wake. Kiera stared after them in astonishment, reeling violently from the shock. Only a few minutes had passed and it was already over. In spite of the astronomical odds stacked against them, each of them had somehow managed to survive. No thanks to me. She took a step backwards, picking up her fallen knife with a trembling hand. I did nothing but scream and split their concentration. It's a miracle that... That's when something moved beneath her boot. That's when she looked down to see that some of what she thought to be corpses were still technically alive. She let out a quiet gasp as the wolf pushed to its feet, standing so close that she could see every fleck of copper around the center of its eyes. His lips curled back in a blistering snarl as it leapt with sudden ferocity upon her. Only this time, she was still carrying the blade. She collapsed beneath the weight, lodging the knife between its ribs at the same time. There was a distant shout as the men rushed towards her, but it was already over. The beast was dead. Her eyes drifted up from its body to see two bloodied faces haloed in the stars. I did it, she gasped. I got one. Then she blacked out. Needless to say, the friends decided to move camp. While the fight with the wolves was a technical success, it had come at a heavy price. Skin was torn, bones were broken, even their packs had been strewn open and burned in the fire. They salvaged whatever they could, then began patching themselves up as well, boiling a cauldron of water to remove the blood, then toweling off quickly in the cold. Are you all right? Jessie asked softly, appearing suddenly at Kiera's side. It was one of the few words any of them had spoken. Since dousing the fire and limping through the shadowed trees, all three of them had been remarkably subdued. Unable to speak, she leaned into his hand. "Of course she's all right," Eden murmured, trying a bandage around his arm as he threw her an unexpected smile. "The girl's a hero, didn't you see?" Jessie smiled as well, remembering her gasping revelation, then turned with sudden seriousness to the Fae. "Thank you for what you did. I really thought that one had me." Eden merely nodded, staring into the trees. "We don't know if this is over. They could come back in the night." He settled down in absolute exhaustion, glancing up just before he laid down. "Will you take the first watch?" Jessie's eyes caught in the moonlight, warming with a secret smile. "Of course." The friends took a day to recover. Kiera would have taken two, but after their run-in with the wolves, they were suddenly anxious for the journey to be over. They pressed hard for another few days before, all at once, before she was nearly ready, the moment was upon them. The scenery grew familiar. The road narrowed and became less used. The sound of the river rushed in her ears, beckoning them down the same forest trail she'd walked 1,000 times. And, just like that, they had arrived. Cataling. Kiera stopped just inside the woods, unable to step forward and see it for herself. Even saying the name in her head, nothing about the place felt familiar. The forest rang with an unnatural quiet, and the smell of smoke still lingered on the breeze. It was in that very moment, at the end of her desperate journey, that she realized a part of her had never wanted to come back. She'd seen the place die once. Did she really need to see it again? "Kiera?" Jessie's voice echoed softly behind her, bringing her back into the light. In a show of respect, the others had stopped when she had, waiting in silence as she gathered her breath. "Are you ready?" Her eyes drifted behind him to a little bucket tangled amongst the weeds. "Yes, I'm ready." Before she could change her mind, she took his hand, and the three of them stepped out of the forest and into the blackened wasteland she had once called her home. Holy hell! She froze where she stood, stunned to the core. There hadn't been a single day since that blazing fire that she hadn't cursed herself for not turning around and racing straight back towards the village. Not because she thought there might be survivors. She'd known for certain there were not. But because she had to see it for herself. There was no way to process otherwise. No way to seek that elusive sense of closure and begin to find some peace. Now that she'd finally returned, she felt strangely indifferent. There was simply nothing left. She'd expected some trace of it, an outline of a garden, the skeletal remains of a building, a few pieces of laundry waving defiantly in the breeze. But it had simply been erased. The ground was dark and flat. "They say this was a wildfire," Eden murmured, trailing a piece of ash between his fingers as he stared over the barren field. "A blaze that started in the village and spiraled out of control." Jessie stood a few paces behind him. "But there would be scaffolding, pieces of trees." "Not necessarily," the Fae murmured, gauging the distance to the forest. There was a grim set to his mouth, but none of the sudden revelation Kiera had been expecting. "I've seen it before." The two men shared a quick look before glancing in opposite directions. "They don't believe me." A rush of feeling swept over her. Then all at once she was running. In a flash the memories came back to her, and she had no need for scaffolding, no need for skeletal outlines or tattered remains. She could imagine it all perfectly. The shape of every doorway, the sunlit blossoms that dangled from every tree. She could hear the dogs barking from the streets, and the sound of drunken laughter drifting from the tavern. She could smell the fresh-baked bread set out every Sunday morning by the old woman who'd lived across the street. She ran until she could run no further, never hearing the call of voices behind her, sprinting with no thought of destination until she caught her boot on a rock and fell painfully to her knees. Tears slipped down her cheeks, vanishing into the wasted earth. Her entire world vanished in the breath of a dragon. Did she even believe it herself? Kiera! Jesse raced up behind her, the Fae tight on his heels. He stared helplessly at the back of her head before sinking down beside her. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry. She stared blankly at the ashes, not a hint of emotion on her face. This was my home, she whispered. The men shared another look before a gentle hand appeared on her back. I'm sorry, I didn't hear. This was my home! She pounded a fist against the ground, feeling it splinter and crack. It might have been cold and lonely. It might have been the single place in the world I was always trying to escape, but it was my home. You only ever get one. A deathly quiet fell over them, stretching from horizon to horizon. She leaned into it, not caring if it ever managed to break. What did she care if there was a dragon? What did she care if others thought it was a wildfire? The damage was done. There was no one left to save. Then, all at once, Eden knelt down beside her. His brow tightened with a little frown as he traced the imprint made by her fist, sweeping aside the ash with the tips of his fingers to reveal something hard and unnatural underneath. He leaned closer to examine it, before pulling back with a sudden gasp. That's not possible. Kiera shot him a look, then leaned forward to see for herself, freezing in shock when she saw a pale reflection of her own face. It's glass, Jessie said in astonishment. The entire thing's been turned to glass. Eden stood up slowly, his face stilling with dread. Nothing can turn dirt into glass, not even a dragon. Kiera merely stared at her reflection, balanced precariously on her knees. It wasn't an image she recognized, that wide-eyed girl staring up from the ash, but it was one that was becoming familiar, one that was changing day by day, evolving into something more. But this wasn't a regular dragon, she said suddenly, pushing to her feet. As I'm constantly reminding everyone, this one had 3 heads. Eden stared at her a moment as Jessie's lips curved with the ghost of a smile. It came from the east? The Fae asked abruptly. That's all you were able to see from the forest. It swooped down upon the village, raining fire from the sky. She nodded slowly, never breaking his gaze. What does that mean? He stared a second longer at the glass before lifting that troubled gaze to the horizon. I don't know, but I promise you, we're going to find out. This has been Beginnings, written by W.J. May, narrated by Zach Smith.